Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. The Room That Doesn't Exist, San Francisco, Autumn. This city never sleeps, but at night, it takes on a strange quietness, different from the hustle and bustle of the day. The long, narrow streets, the old houses with high windows, are an indispensable part of the city's landscape. Every time I walk on the rainy streets, I feel a sense of unease. The colors of the street lights reflect on the puddles, making the scenery vague, like an untold story. I moved to the city in the hope of finding a new start. After my job in the previous city ended, I decided to start over in an unfamiliar place. The apartment I rented was on the third floor of an old building in the suburbs. When I came to see the house, the realtor only said one short sentence. "This room will be great, but there is something special that you should know." The image of the room was imprinted in my mind from the first time I saw it. A small room with a large window facing the front, with dim light coming in from the street lamps outside. The interior was simple, but it exuded an unforgettable antiquity. I couldn't deny that there was something strange about this room, but I think I just felt too much and decided to sign the contract immediately. The first evening, I entered that room with trepidation, not knowing if this was the place where I would start over. The house was strangely quiet. No noise, no footsteps of people around. I sat at the desk, letting the dim light shine on the pile of books and papers. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt something was wrong. This room was not like the places I had lived before. There was a silence that made me uncomfortable. Then I started to hear slight noises at night. At first it was just the creaking of the wooden floor, but gradually it became more distinct, as if someone was walking around the room while I was asleep. Every time I woke up in the middle of the night, I heard the footsteps. Sometimes they stopped right in front of the door, and I heard breathing, as if someone was standing outside, not moving. One evening, as I sat writing at my desk, I heard a light knocking coming from the hallway. I thought it was from another apartment, but when I opened the door, I saw an empty hallway with no one there. Only the light from afar away was shining in, casting long shadows on the walls. I told myself that I was imagining things, but then the knocking came again, closer this time. "I can't live in fear like this," I told myself, and closed the door, trying not to think about the sounds. But every night they came, regular and unchanging. There was something strange about this room. It was not just a place to stay, but also a nightmare that never ended. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, stalked by something invisible. The story of this room really began on a rainy night. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, but I heard strange noises coming from behind the wall. At first it was just whispers, but then they became clearer, as if someone was talking to someone. Only I couldn't make out the words. These sounds made me feel like I was being surrounded, as if this room was not just a physical space, but also a place that contained things that I couldn't see. As I got out of bed and walked towards the wall, I felt a cold breeze brush against me, even though there was no wind. The light from outside cast a long shadow on the floor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing behind me, watching me. I approached the wall, pressed my hand against it, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, I heard a very soft sigh, almost inaudible, and then a voice spoke, soft but like a curse. "This room doesn't belong to you. You can't be here." My whole body stiffened. I turned around, but there was only darkness and the sound of rain outside the window. But I knew I was no longer safe in this room, and I couldn't leave without solving what was happening here. Entering this room, I had accidentally touched an unsolvable secret, and now I had to find the answer before it was too late. After the first night in the new room, the strange feeling still haunted me. At first, I thought the noises were just the wind or natural phenomena in the old house, but gradually I began to feel that they were not so simple. Every night when I turned off the light and lay down on the bed, the room became colder, as if something was waiting for me in the darkness. The strange sounds appeared on the second night. At first, there were soft breathing sounds, as if someone was standing near my bed, watching me as I slept. I did not dare to open my eyes, but each cold wave made me shiver. The breathing gradually turned into whispers, the words unclear, but enough to make me feel uneasy. "Get out, get out." The voice was soft but urgent. I did not dare to move, did not dare to open my eyes. These sounds kept repeating, and I felt my heart pounding. After a while, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I opened my eyes, but saw nothing but pitch black darkness in the room. The room was the same, just me and the strange noises coming from the four walls, making me feel surrounded. But the strange thing was, as I started to listen more closely, I realized that the sound wasn't coming from just one place. The whisper seemed to be coming from every corner of the room, from under the bed, from the closet, and even from within the walls. "Get out! There's no place for you here." The words became clearer and clearer. I sat up, my heart pounding, cold sweat running down my forehead. I turned on the light, feeling my heart tighten with fear. But the strange noises didn't go away. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. There was nothing but pitch black, only the streetlights casting a little light into the room through the window. But when I turned around, I noticed something terrifying. The wall to my left had a long crack, a crack that had never been there before. I couldn't remember if it had ever been there before, but now it was more obvious than ever. I felt like I couldn't keep quiet about what was happening. A strange feeling invaded my mind. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. I walked closer to the wall, pressed my hand against it, and suddenly I heard a light tapping sound from the other side. Not breathing, not whispering, but a steady tapping sound, as if someone was trying to call me from behind. I froze, not daring to move. The tapping sounds weren't coming from outside, but from inside the wall. I didn't know what to do. My mind was in turmoil. But one thing I knew for sure: this room wasn't normal. These noises weren't coincidences. They were aimed at me. I looked around the room, searching for some sign that could explain all this, but nothing was clear. Finally, I decided to explore the wall. I couldn't live in this fear forever. I took the small hammer I had brought with me and started to gently tap the crack. The feeling of the hammer hitting the wall startled me, but I didn't stop. Each steady hit of the hammer seemed to increase the tension in the space. After a few hits, the wall began to break, and I could see inside. I couldn't believe my eyes. Inside the wall was a narrow, dark space. And there, in the darkness, I saw an object in the corner of the room. I slowly approached, and the light from the flashlight illuminated something looming in the darkness. It was a wooden box, the outside of which had rotted over time. My heart sank, but I couldn't stop. I took the flashlight and shined it inside the box. Inside the box was an old photo. The colors faded with time. It was a group photo, but there was a woman standing at the far end, her long hair hanging down, her face obscured. I couldn't make out who she was, but a strange feeling rose in my heart. I began to feel like this photo was watching me, as if there was some kind of connection. While I was looking at the photo, the knocking from the wall sounded again, this time clearer and stronger. "Get out!" The voice rang in my head, this time not a whisper, but a clear command. The cold feeling enveloped me again, and I couldn't stand still. I turned around, but the photo was still there, like a haunting. I couldn't understand why this photo appeared in this room. Was she the one who died in this room? And maybe she was the cause of all these strange events. At this point, I realized that I could no longer escape the truth. I had entered a story from which there was no turning back, and I did not know what to do to escape the haunting ghosts that were haunting me. The next morning, I still couldn't shake off the haunting memory of the strange room and the noises that had happened the night before. I couldn't understand why I felt that way. It felt like something was haunting me, something that was trying to drown me in darkness, like a curse that I couldn't shake. When I stepped out of the room, the air was still gloomy and cold. I felt like I was entering another world, where inexplicable things were waiting. No matter how hard I tried to cut off the connection with the strange events, they kept replaying in my head, as if an invisible force was controlling my every move. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo I found in the wooden box. The woman in the photo, her face blurred and her eyes lifeless, continued to haunt me. I felt like she was following me, like an inseparable shadow. But why was she in this room? Why did I feel her presence? Even though she was no longer alive, I decided to learn more about the history of this building, hoping to find a reasonable explanation for all the strange events I had experienced. I went to see the building manager, whom I had met before. However, when I asked about the rooms, he became evasive. His answers were unclear, as if he was trying to hide something. But when I pressed him about my room, he just sighed and said, "That room has been abandoned for many years. No one wants to rent it. There are things that happen there, things I can't tell you. It's better that you don't find out more." That warning made me even more suspicious. The strange events might have a connection to the past of this building. I had to find out the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. Determined to find out, I returned to the room. The room was no longer as quiet as before. Every step I took on the wooden floor made creaking sounds, as if someone was watching me. I looked around, feeling like the room contained an invisible force, something that had been buried all this time. As I approached the wall, I couldn't help but feel the change. The cracks in the wall seemed to have widened a little compared to yesterday, and I could see a dark void behind it more clearly. The strange noises rang out again, this time stronger and clearer. I stopped, feeling a sudden cold air blow by, as if an invisible door had just opened. Suddenly, I felt a change in the space around me. The light in the room began to change. The shadows from the furniture in the room began to dance on the walls. I stood there, not daring to move. But I knew in my heart that something terrible was waiting behind this wall. I couldn't resist anymore. I decided to break the wall. Taking the hammer, I started to hit the wall hard. Each strong hit caused the wall to break, but I didn't feel any relief. The lights in the room flickered. Darkness seemed to envelop me. And when I looked into the space behind the wall, I saw a strange space. Another room, small and dark. No windows. Just a simple bed with an old set of sheets. The musty and fishy smell filled my nose, making me feel nauseous. I stepped in, holding a flashlight and shining it everywhere. And as soon as the light stopped, I saw something on the bed. A woman. She lay there, her eyes closed, her skin pale as a corpse. Her body had rotted, but her face still held the look of fear and pain. I couldn't breathe when I looked into those closed eyes. She wasn't a ghost, nor a hallucination. She was a real corpse, long dead. After discovering the woman's corpse in the secret room, I could no longer deny that this place contained something more terrible than I had imagined. Horror coursed through my veins, and even after I left the room, I could not erase the image of her body. Her eyes closed, her pale face, and the bruises around her neck. Someone had killed her, but I did not know who. And the scariest thing was that I felt that, even after all this time, that person was still here somewhere. I locked the door, trying to breathe evenly and think rationally. I needed to leave this apartment, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The darkness in the room seemed to thicken, and the shadows dancing on the walls seemed to laugh at me. I shivered, feeling a chill run down my spine. A knock on the door. I jumped. The knock wasn't loud, just a soft sound, but in this silent space, it sounded haunting. I hesitated, wondering whether to open the door or not. Who was outside? Or what? I took a deep breath, slowly approaching the door. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. No one was standing there. But something else made me shiver. There was a handprint on my door. Faint, but definitely real. It wasn't a normal stain, but like someone had put their hand on the door. But the hand was so cold that it left a wet mark. I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding. I slammed the door shut, retreating towards the bed. No, I couldn't stay here another minute. I needed to leave immediately, but just then, the lights in the room went out. The air became thick, as if the room was being suffocated by an invisible force. I reached for the switch, but as I touched it, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. "You shouldn't be here," I screamed, jumping back, my whole body shaking with terror. The voice, it didn't come from anywhere, but seemed to be inside my head. It was soft, but full of resentment. I turned on the flashlight from my phone, shining it around the room. No one was there, but I knew I wasn't alone. I looked back at the wall where I'd broken through last night. The black void behind it was still there, like a black hole sucking in all the light. I felt something standing inside, watching me. Trying to calm myself, I turned around, gathering my things. I needed to get out of here now. But as I reached the door, a cold wind swept in, and the door slammed shut in front of me. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. The door wasn't locked, but it wouldn't open. It was as if an invisible force was holding it. I pulled hard, banged on the door, but to no avail. I was trapped in my own apartment. Then, suddenly, the mirror on the wall shook. I turned my head, looking at it in panic. In the dim light of my phone, I saw a figure appear in the mirror. It wasn't me, but a woman. She stood there, her long hair hanging down, her face pale, her eyes wide but lifeless. But the scariest thing was, when I looked closer, there was a deep purple bruise on her neck. She was the woman in the photo, the body I found in the secret room. Her mouth moved without a sound, but I understood what she was saying. A sentence repeated over and over, like a curse from the dead. "Go now. He's coming." "Him? Who is he?" "I don't know. I don't know anything." But her spirit was trying to warn me, and I knew one thing. I didn't have much time left. The door still wouldn't open. I turned to look in the mirror, but she was gone. With no other choice, I rushed to the window, trying to find a way to open it and escape. But as I touched the frame, I felt a cold hand grip my wrist. I screamed, yanking my hand back, my heart pounding. But no one was there. The darkness in the room grew thicker. Whispers began to echo from the four walls, like hundreds of voices harmonizing together, forming a terrifying chorus. I had to get out of here. I pounded on the door with all my might, and this time it swung open. Without a second thought, I dashed into the hallway, running straight down the stairs, not daring to look back. When I was outside, I stopped, trying to catch my breath. It felt like I was waking up from a nightmare. I turned to look back at the building. My apartment window was still dark, but in that moment, I saw a figure standing behind the glass, silently looking down at me. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it wasn't me. And then, the window slammed shut. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was certain. I couldn't go back to that apartment. Story 2, Curse of the Mask, San Diego. A sunny city with bustling streets and long beaches. But I never thought that, amidst all that beauty, I would accidentally bring home something that could change my life forever. It all started when I walked into a small antique shop deep in an old alley. From the outside, it looked old and shabby, with a faded wooden sign and a layer of dust covering the glass windows. I had no intention of stopping by, but somehow my feet just walked in without thinking. Inside, dim lights illuminated a series of strange items. Old clocks, faded paintings, wooden statues with distorted faces. But what immediately caught my attention was a mask sitting on a glass shelf in the corner of the room. It was unlike any mask I had ever seen. Made of black wood, the patterns carved into the surface looked like some ancient ritual. The eye sockets were empty, but something held my gaze, as if it were looking back at me from within. "Is there anything special about this?" I asked the shopkeeper, an old man with a wrinkled face and deep-set eyes. He stared at me for a moment before shaking his head. "This mask isn't for you." I laughed. "Then who is it for?" He was silent, his eyes full of warning. But I didn't care. There was something about the mask that I couldn't take my eyes off. A strange curiosity, as if it was calling me. I decided to buy it. As I left the shop, the shopkeeper stood watching, but said nothing more. Little did I know that would be the last time I would be warned. I took the mask back to my small apartment, where I lived alone in the gas lamp quarter of downtown San Diego. That night I placed it on my desk and sat looking at it in the yellow light from the desk lamp. There was something wrong with this mask. Something. It felt like it was changing the longer I looked at it. The wood grain seemed to move ever so slightly, as if it were breathing. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining it. But then, in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a strange sound. A whisper. It was very soft, but clear, like someone was standing right next to my ear. I jumped up and looked around the room. There was no one. Only the mask was still on the desk. I slowly approached it. Nothing had changed. But when I touched it, a chill ran down my spine. And then, just as I was about to pull my hand away, I saw it. A shadow reflected in the mirror. Someone was standing right behind me. I turned around immediately. No one was there. My heart was pounding. I felt a chill pass through me, as if someone had just walked past me. I looked back at the mask. It was still there. But now, those empty eye sockets were no longer lifeless. I felt like someone was watching me from within. And then, I heard it again. A whisper as light as a breath. Put it on. I backed away, my heart beating faster. The room became eerily quiet. Little did I know, from this moment on, I had awakened something that should not have been awakened. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. The room was dark, save for the dim light of the street lights coming in through the windows. I couldn't remember when I fell asleep, but something made me feel uneasy. It felt like someone was standing in the room, silently watching me from some hidden corner. I sat up, took a deep breath. Everything was the same. The desk, the bookshelf, the mask still there, motionless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this room no longer belonged to me. Put it on. The whisper rang out again. I was startled. My heart stopped. The voice echoed in my head. Not sure where it came from, but I knew it had something to do with the mask. I looked at the desk. The mask was still in the same place, but something was wrong. The carvings on the wood seemed to have changed ever so slightly, as if it had moved. I stood up, slowly approaching the table, but a chill ran down my spine as soon as I touched it. The mask was damp and cold, as if someone had just held it. I let go immediately, stepping back. No, I couldn't let this fear control me. This was just a harmless antique, right? I reassured myself and decided to go back to sleep. But as soon as I turned around, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The mirror in the corner of the room. I saw myself in it, but something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror didn't quite match my movements. When I stood still, the image in the mirror moved slightly. A beat slower, I blinked, and then I saw it. A figure stood behind me, wearing the mask. I turned around, but the room was empty. The mask was still on the table, motionless. My whole body was shaking. It couldn't be. What had I seen? Am I losing my mind? I didn't dare look in the mirror anymore. I rushed to my bed, pulled the covers over my head. But as soon as I closed my eyes, a terrible nightmare began. In my dream, I saw myself standing in a dark forest. All around me were tall trees, their branches reaching out like bony hands. I didn't know where I was, but there was a small path ahead, leading deep into the darkness. A cold wind blew through, carrying vague whispers. Voices repeated over and over. You shouldn't have taken it. You shouldn't have touched it. I felt an invisible force pushing me forward. I tried to resist, but my feet moved forward automatically. The air became thick, the darkness thicker. I felt like I was entering a forgotten place. where time no longer existed. And then I saw it. In the middle of the forest, an old stone platform covered with moss, and on it was the mask. But it was no longer lifeless. It was moving. The lines carved into the wood curled like veins, and from the empty eye sockets, a pair of eyes appeared, wide open, staring straight at me. Put it on. The voice echoed throughout the forest, reverberating in my mind. I wanted to run, but my body couldn't move. A dark figure appeared behind the stone pedestal, gradually revealing itself. It was a man, wearing a tattered cloak, his face hidden by that very mask. But he didn't stand still. He began to move toward me. With each step he took, the ground shook. I felt a primal fear rise, a fear that couldn't be expressed in words. He didn't say anything, but I knew what he wanted. He wanted me. As soon as he reached out for me, I screamed and woke up. I sat up, cold sweat pouring down my body. My heart was pounding like it was going to burst out of my chest. Everything was still where it was. My room, my desk, the mask. But something was wrong. The mask was no longer on the desk. It was right next to my bed. I froze. I didn't remember touching it. I didn't remember moving it. But now it was there, just inches from me. I swallowed, trying to calm myself. I couldn't stay here anymore. I grabbed the mask, threw it into the closet, and slammed the door shut. But as I turned away, I heard breathing. It wasn't coming from me. It was coming from inside the closet. I stepped back, eyes glued to the closet door, and then it swung open. I stood frozen in front of the opened closet door. The mask was no longer there, as I had hastily stuffed it in. It had rolled out, sprawled on the floor, its empty eye sockets staring at me. The air in the room thickened, and in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. Something was here with me. I backed away, my breathing quickening. But even as I tried to calm myself, the chilling feeling still washed over me. Then, a whisper rang out. It came from somewhere in the room. Put it on. I didn't move. It wasn't my voice. It couldn't be. I turned to look at the mask. It had moved. I was sure it wasn't where it had been. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was closer to me. I swallowed. The room felt too small, too claustrophobic. I need to get out of here. I rushed towards the door, but as soon as I touched the handle, it didn't open. I yanked. The lock was still on, but the door felt like it was being held tightly from the other side. No, it can't be, I muttered, pulling the door harder. The whisper came again. You can't escape. This time, the voice wasn't gentle. It was whispering, right next to my ear, so close that I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck. I shivered, my heart pounding. I turned around, but there was no one. There was only the mask lying in the middle of the room. I could no longer control my breathing. I felt like I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing. This mask was more than just an inanimate antique. It was alive. Trying to stay calm, I pulled away from him, trying to break the tension. I grabbed my phone, intending to call someone, anyone. But when I opened the screen, I was stunned. On the screen, there were no contacts, no apps, just a single image, a picture of me, sleeping. My heart stopped. I never took this picture. But what really terrified me was that in the picture, there was someone else standing in the corner. I threw my phone on the bed, my whole body shaking. What should I do? I couldn't stay in this apartment another second. I needed to leave. I ran to the window, but as soon as I put my hand on the glass, I saw myself in it, not my reflection. Another version of me, but with black eyes, mouth curved in a crooked smile. It didn't move with me. I screamed, stepping back, my heart pounding in my chest. But as soon as I turned around, the room became eerily quiet. Everything stopped. I gasped, trying to make sense of what was happening. But then, a voice rang out, clearer than ever. Wear it, or you won't be able to get out. I looked down at the floor. The mask was no longer still. It was standing upright, facing me, as if an invisible hand was holding it up. No? I shook my head, stepping back, but an invisible force gripped me. I felt a strong pressure pushing me forward. I struggled, but it was no use. I was pulled toward the mask. And then darkness fell. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the room. I was somewhere, further away. I stood in the middle of an old room, the walls cracked and dusty. Light shone through cracks in the ceiling, and the air was stuffy, as if no one had been here for decades. But the most terrifying thing was not the desolate scene. It was the portraits hanging on the walls. They were all lifeless faces, but there was one thing in common. They all wore masks. I couldn't breathe. How had I been dragged here? What the hell was this place? I turned around, looking for an exit, but the door behind me had disappeared. I was stuck. And then, a voice rang out from behind me. Welcome. It's time. I stood still. The darkness around me was thick, covering me like an invisible curtain. The old, dusty room, the portraits on the walls, all part of some forgotten ritual. And the voice. It came from behind me. Welcome. It's time. I turned around. No one. But in that moment, I felt an invisible presence. The air in the room was heavier, as if a pair of eyes were watching me from the darkness. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the portraits. All the people in the paintings wore the same mask. My heart pounded. These paintings, something was wrong. I squinted to take a closer look, and then I saw it. One of the portraits moved. Not the wind, not the light. The face in the painting moved. I froze. A chill ran down my spine. I spun around, running toward where the door had been. But it was gone. The wall in front of me was now a blank surface, as if the door had never existed. I pounded on it, frantically trying to get out, but to no avail. I was trapped. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I needed to find a way out. I scanned the room, searching for any sign. But the only thing there were the lifeless portraits, still silently looking down at me from above. And then the mask appeared. It was right in the middle of the room, as if it had just been placed there. It was no longer an inanimate object. It was waiting for me. I shook my head. I couldn't let it control me. I needed to stay sane. But then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy. They came from behind me. I turned around, but there was no one. Only portraits, but this time, all the eyes in the painting were on me. My whole body went cold. I couldn't stand still. I lunged for the mask, intending to kick it aside, but as soon as my foot touched it, an invisible wave pushed me to the floor. It felt like an invisible hand had grabbed me and thrown me away. I gasped, but there was no time to think. The darkness in the room began to shrink, as if I was being sucked into another dimension. I struggled, but my body felt frozen. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the room, wearing a mask. I couldn't see his face. but I knew he was looking at me. He raised a finger, slowly placing it where the mouth should have been on the mask. Shh! My throat felt tight. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. And then he started to move towards me. With each step he took, the room shook. The portraits on the walls twisted, distorted, as if they were affected by his presence. He stopped right in front of me. I couldn't move. He bent down, slowly lifting the mask in his hand. Your turn. I felt the coldness of the wood as it pressed against my skin. I tried to struggle, but it was as if some force was holding me down. The mask continued to press tighter against my face. And as soon as it covered my head, I heard a scream. Not my scream, but the screams of all the souls who had worn it before. And then, complete darkness enveloped me. I don't remember how long I'd been unconscious. When I opened my eyes, I felt dizzy, my body shrouded in a thick fog. The air around me was heavy, the smell of mold and ash seeping into every breath. I wasn't in my old room anymore. Instead, I was lying on a cold stone floor, dark cracks under my feet like veins leaking from the ground. Darkness surrounded me in all directions, but dimly in the distance, I could see a row of burning candles. Their weak light wasn't enough to illuminate the space around me, but I knew I wasn't alone. I sat up, breathing heavily. In the darkness, I could feel a pair of eyes watching me. Not one pair, many pairs, lurking in the darkness waiting. Then I saw him. He stood there, in the middle of the room, still holding the black wooden mask. The space around him distorted, as if reality were being distorted by his mere presence. He didn't move, but I felt as if an invisible force was pressing down on me, keeping me from looking away from him. You've got it on. I flinched. The voice didn't come from him, but from inside my head. A chill ran down my spine. I reached up to my face and realized the mask was firmly attached to my skin. I screamed, trying to pull it off, but to no avail. The hard wood seemed to have become one with my face, impossible to remove. I tried to grasp its edges, but every time I touched it, 1,000 needles of pain shot through my skull. He stepped closer, slowly. You've awakened them, he whispered, his voice echoing, as if coming from many places at once. Now you'll see. I shook my head, desperately trying to free myself from the mask. But then, the room began to move. The walls shook, the ground beneath me cracked, and from the darkness around me, long, twisted hands reached out. They crawled across the ground, creeping toward me, long nails scraping against the stone, making a sickening sound. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, but my body no longer obeyed me. I was held in place, as if an invisible string was tying me to this twisted reality. And then I saw faces. No, not the faces of the living. Dead faces, all of them wearing the same mask as mine. Their eye sockets were black and hollow, their mouths wide open, but no sound came out. These entities crawled toward me, latched onto my legs, pulled me down. Let me go. I don't belong here, I screamed, but no one heard. He stood there watching me with a calm that was terrifying. He didn't stop them. He let them drag me down. Darkness enveloped me. I felt myself falling into a deep, endless abyss. Then I woke up. I opened my eyes, breathing heavily, my heart pounding. I was still in my apartment. Everything seemed the same, but there was one distinct change. The mask was no longer on the table. I searched the room. There was no trace of it. But when I reached the bathroom, I stopped short. The mirrored cabinet door was ajar. I swallowed, slowly approaching. As I looked into the mirror, I felt my blood freeze. I saw myself in the mirror, but I was no longer wearing the mask. But my shadow was. I backed away, but the reflection no longer moved with me. It stood still, looking at me through the glass. I could feel that lifeless gaze, the gaze of 100 damned souls. And then my shadow laughed. Now it's your turn. The mirror shattered. The room was plunged into darkness. Story 3. Stranger in the library. I work in an old library in a small town in the south of England. The town is not very busy. The majority of the residents are older people, and at night it is almost completely silent. The library where I work reflects that. An old building with towering bookshelves filled with books that have faded in time. I started working here 3 months ago, with a late shift that runs from 7 p.m. to midnight. The library rarely has visitors at this time, except for a few local students or people looking for a quiet place to work. But recently, I have noticed a strange man appearing at the same time. He always arrives around 9 p.m., wearing an old coat and hat, and always chooses to sit at the last table in the library. He never borrowed books or spoke to anyone, just sat reading the same book every night, an untitled book with a worn leather cover. I never saw his face clearly because the lights in the library were always dim, and he always sat in the darkest corner. But there was one thing that I couldn't help but notice. I never saw him leave. Every night, when it was time to close, I would check all the areas to make sure no one was still in the library. But every time I returned to his desk, the chair was empty. There were no footsteps, no sign of anyone leaving. Only the book remained open on the table. I began to feel that something was wrong. One night, I decided to follow him. I pretended to continue working after turning off the lights, deliberately stalling for time to see if he would leave. But when I looked up from the front desk, he was gone. There was no sound to signal his departure, no footprints on the old tiles. Only the book remained open on the table, as if someone had left in a supernatural moment. I approached, slowly turning the pages. The pages were yellowed. The handwriting was so tangled that I could not read it. But when I turned to the last page, I saw a line. It was not an ordinary paragraph, but a warning. He is still here. He never leaves. My whole body felt cold. The room became strangely quiet, as if the space had contracted, swallowing even the sound of my breathing. And then I heard it, a whisper right behind me. I turned sharply. No one was there. But from the corner of the library, in the deepest darkness, I saw a figure, and he was staring at me. I stood frozen in place, my breath catching in my throat. The figure in the corner of the library didn't move, but I could clearly feel him looking at me. He had no face, or at least in the dim light, I couldn't see any details. There was only a pair of dark, deep eyes, as if they reflected no light. I wanted to run away, but my body felt frozen. A strange chill swept over me, not from the air, but from him. Clank. A book from a nearby shelf fell to the ground, making a dry sound in the quiet space. I turned my head in surprise, but when I looked back toward that dark corner, he was gone. There was no one there. There was only the old bookshelf and the thick darkness. I took a step back, trying to catch my breath. Could it be my imagination? Or maybe the dim light and fatigue had fooled me. But then, I remembered the words in the book on the table. He's still here. He never left. The warning gripped my mind like an invisible claw. I turned back to the table, where the book was still open at the last page. I reached out to flip through the previous pages to see what this book was really about. But as I flipped through the pages, I found them all blank. No words, no pictures, just blank pages. A chill ran down my spine. I'd clearly read the warning earlier, but now all the content was gone, as if it had never existed. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Was I losing my mind? Or was something playing tricks on me? Clack, another book fell from the shelf. I turned around, faster this time, and I saw it. Not a shadow, not an illusion, but a dark handprint on the spine of the book that had just fallen. I swallowed, moving closer. The handprint was not ordinary dirt. It was a dark liquid, sticky like tar. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingertips brushed the surface, a whisper rang out right next to my ear. "Don't open it." I froze. The voice was unlike any I had ever heard. It had no emotion, as if it came from an entity no longer of this world. But I couldn't stop. I bent down, picked up the book, and with trembling hands turned the cover. There was no title, no author, just a single line, written in blood-red ink. "If you see him, it will be too late." My breathing became heavy. I quickly closed the book, but as I did, all the lights in the library went out. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. I stood still, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear something moving in the library. Not footsteps, but something gliding across the shelves, silently and smoothly, as if it didn't need to walk. Rustle. It was coming towards me. I held my breath, my hand clutching the book in my lap. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel a presence right in front of me. And then I heard it breathing. Very softly, very lightly, but right next to my ear. I wasn't alone anymore. My throat was dry, my body tense. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, could only stand there, feeling the coldness of something invisible pressing against me. Suddenly, a cold draft blew across the back of my neck. It was right behind me. I stopped thinking. I lunged forward, running through the dark shelves, bumping into tables, stacks of books falling all around me. I didn't care. I just knew I had to run. I could feel it chasing me. There was no sound of footsteps, but the air around me grew thicker, as if something was following me, tightening around me every second. Finally, I slammed into the main door of the library. I turned the knob frantically. It was locked. No way. I hadn't locked the door. How could it be locked? I turned around, gasping. The library became eerily quiet. No more rustling, no more feeling of being watched. But when I looked up, I saw him. He was standing right in the middle of the library, in the dim light of the only street light outside, shining through the windows. He had no face. He didn't move, but I knew he was watching me. And then he started to raise his hand. His hand rose slowly, pointing straight at me, as if in warning. Just then, the lights in the library came back on. The door swung open. I rushed out, stumbling on the steps. I looked up out the window. He was gone. But I knew. He didn't leave. He never left. I don't know how long I sat on the steps outside the library. My breathing was still unsteady, my limbs shaking. The library door behind me was still open, the yellow light from inside shining out onto the empty street. I stared into the darkness inside, where he had stood just minutes ago. He was gone, but I knew he had never left. The feeling of dread still gripped me. I scanned the quiet street, the rows of silent houses, submerged in the thick darkness. There was no one but me. No sign that this small town was awake. Just me and him. I needed to get out of here. I had to go home, try to get some sleep, to forget what had just happened. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something I could just ignore. I staggered to my feet, but as soon as I turned around, I saw a silhouette reflected in the glass door of the library. He was standing right behind me. My heart stopped. I turned around. No one. The clear glass door reflected the empty image of the library. I blinked, taking a few steps back. The figure was gone, but I was sure I had seen it. Unable to stay here another second, I rushed home. I didn't dare look back. My small apartment was on the second floor of an old building, about a 10-minute walk from the library. I locked the door after entering, bolted all the windows, and pulled the curtains down. I needed to feel safe, even though I knew something had followed me. I plopped down on the bed, trying to control my breathing. But even though I was home, I couldn't get the image of him out of my mind. Those empty eyes, that stiff figure standing in the darkness of the library. I tried to think rationally. Maybe I was overworking myself. Maybe the dim light was making me imagine him. But no. It felt too real, too clear. I took out my phone to check the time. 2:37 a.m. I opened the message, then closed it. I wanted to call someone, but I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me. Then I realized something. My phone had no signal. I frowned. The Wi-Fi was down. I tried restarting it, but it didn't work. And then, my phone screen turned on by itself. The screen was blank. No missed calls, no messages. But then slowly, a line of text began to appear. I am here. I threw the phone on the bed, breathing heavily. It couldn't be. No one could send this message without a signal. A knock sounded. It came from the bedroom window. I slowly turned my head. I pulled back the curtains and looked outside. No one was there. But when I bent down to look more closely, I saw a handprint on the glass. Cold, steamy. I stepped back, clutching the blanket. I had no doubt. He had followed me home. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like there was something in the room, silently watching me from some corner I couldn't see. I tried to ignore it, trying to tell myself that it was all my imagination. But when I opened my eyes in the early morning, the door to the closet in the room was wide open, and inside, I saw a book. It was the book without words from the library. I shivered, slowly walking closer. The cover was cold in my hand. I didn't remember bringing it here. I didn't know how it had ended up in my room. And when I opened the first page, the only words I read were, "We're not done yet." I felt my blood run cold. I looked up at the mirror, and he was standing right behind me. I froze. I wanted to turn around to confirm that what I saw in the mirror was just an illusion, but a primal fear held me in place. That figure, he, stood right behind me, unmoving. I could feel the coldness of him, as if an invisible entity was taking over the space around me. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, he was gone. There was nothing but my shadow in the mirror, but I knew he was still here. I swallowed, turning back to the book on the table. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. This time, the words appeared on the blank page. "You saw him. There's no turning back." The warning was short but heavy. I felt like an invisible hand was squeezing my chest. Who wrote these words? Was it him? Or was it someone else, another victim? I backed away slightly, trying to calm myself. I couldn't stay alone in this apartment any longer. I needed open space. I needed light. I needed the library. It wasn't the smartest choice, but it was the only place I could find answers. I grabbed my coat, stuffed the book into my pocket, and rushed out of the apartment. The street was deserted, not a soul in sight. The street lights cast a dim light, casting a misty glow on the wet pavement. I walked as fast as I could, my breath coming out in white puffs in the cold night air. When I reached the library, the door was locked. I fumbled in my pocket for the key, my hands shaking with cold or fear. After a moment of fumbling, I opened the door and slipped inside. There was something different about the atmosphere in the library. Quiet, but not empty. As if the place was holding on to the traces of what had happened last night. I turned on the desk lamp at the front desk. A dim light that spread across the front area. But the darkness at the back of the library was as thick as an impenetrable black curtain. I sat down, put the book on the table, and opened it. If I could find out more about him, about the entity that was haunting me, I might find a way to stop all of this. But before I could read, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, echoing through the rows of bookshelves. Someone was there. I held my breath, lifting my head. I couldn't see anyone in the darkness, but I felt his presence. I lifted the desk lamp, shining light into the aisle between the bookshelves. It was empty, but as soon as I lowered the lamp, I saw him standing right in front of me, so close that I could feel the coldness of him. I screamed, stepping back, but my foot tripped over a chair, and I fell to the floor. I looked up. He was gone. There was only darkness. I gasped, my hands gripping the tabletop. I couldn't keep running away like this. I had to face it. I had to know who he was. I turned back to the book, flipping through the pages, searching for any clues. And then I found another page with words. But this time, it wasn't a warning. I was like you. My heart stopped for a moment. Who wrote these words? Someone who had seen him? Or? I flipped the page again. I saw him too, and I ran away. But running doesn't mean escaping. A soft laugh echoed from deep within the library. He was here. I gritted my teeth and continued reading, though my whole body was shaking. He's not a ghost. He's not a man. He's a forgotten story, a part of the memory of those who have disappeared. He is something that exists between the pages. I closed the book immediately. I understood. All of his victims were left in this book. Those who saw him tried to escape. All disappeared. And this book, it was the only thing that retained their memories. I slowly stood up, trying not to make any sound. I had to leave, but as I turned around, a cold hand landed on my shoulder. I froze. A hollow voice rang out right next to my ear. You saw me. Now you too will belong to the story. I screamed. And then, the lights in the library went out. I don't know what happened after the lights in the library went out. 1 second, I was standing there, feeling a cold hand on my shoulder. The next second, I fell to a completely unfamiliar place. I was no longer in the library. All around me was a pitch black space, filled only with endless rows of bookshelves, piled with old books, covered in thick dust. There was no light, except for a faint strip of light running down the hallway, shining from somewhere below. I couldn't see the end of the place. It was all a maze of books, with no exit. I tried to regulate my breathing, listening to my surroundings. But there was no sound, no wind, no footsteps, no hymn. I stood up, slowly walking past the bookshelves. I don't remember how I got here, or whether this place really exists, or is just a distorted dream created by my own fear. But then I saw it. An old wooden table stood in the middle of the endless hallway. On it was a book, the wordless book I had found in the library. There was just one difference. This time, there were words on the pages. I approached it, my hands shaking as I flipped it open. Handwritten lines were scattered across the page, but it didn't look like a normal story. It was a list of names. I scanned each line. Each name had been crossed out in crimson ink, as if someone had erased it from history. But when I turned to the last page, I saw my name, written clearly in fresh ink, and it wasn't crossed out. I felt my heart sink into the abyss. The people before me, they were gone, and now I was next. I clenched my fists, suddenly realizing something. He didn't kill me right away. He kept me here. He wanted me to be a part of this place. I turned to run, but the bookshelves around me began to shift. Not from the wind, not from the earthquake. They were moving on their own, as if they were closing in, trapping me inside. Crash! A bookshelf fell right in front of me, blocking my way. I backed away, but another one fell behind me, cutting off my escape. I was trapped in this maze of books. And then I heard a rustling sound. It came from above. I looked up and there he was. He clung to the bookshelves, his body curled like a spider crawling down. His face was still in shadow, but I knew he was smiling. "You can't leave." I dashed forward, jumping over the books scattered on the floor. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't let him catch me. Story 4. The Hunt in the Cursed Forest. I don't believe in curses. There's no supernatural force that controls human destiny. At least I've always thought so. But that all changed last fall, when 3 friends and I decided to go on a 3-day hunting trip into the Blackwood Forest, a vast, desolate wilderness in the northern United States. Blackwood is not a popular destination for hunters. The locals tend to avoid it, not because of the lack of wildlife, but because of the scary stories that have been passed down through the generations. It's said that the forest is cursed, that those who venture too far into it will never return. Of course, none of us believed in such things. We arrived in Blackwood late one afternoon, the sky gray and the air damp from the rain the night before. As we pulled up and began to unload, an old man from a nearby town emerged from the woods. He wore a heavy coat. His face was gaunt, and his eyes were deep. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "This forest is not for anyone." We looked at each other, trying not to laugh. One of my friends, Daniel, stepped forward, his voice full of confidence. "Thank you, sir, but we don't believe in ghosts." The old man just shook his head. "Not ghosts, something else. If you want to live, don't go north." We didn't ask any more questions. After he left, I felt a strange unease in my heart. But I told myself that he was just a superstitious old man. We set up camp, lit a fire, and prepared for the next morning's hunt. As night fell, the Blackwood forest became strangely silent. No night birds, no insects, only the wind rustling through the trees. I couldn't sleep. It felt like something was watching us from the shadows. And then, near midnight, I heard footsteps. It wasn't an animal, but a person. I grabbed my shotgun and gently opened the tent flap, my heart pounding. I scanned the camp. There was nothing but darkness, but I knew someone was out there. I retreated into the tent, holding my gun tight. As much as I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't deny the unsettling feeling that crept into every corner of my mind. We weren't alone in Blackwood Forest, and tomorrow morning, we would find out in the worst possible way. I woke up just as the sun was rising, a faint light filtering through the tall trees. I had slept restlessly the night before, not because of the cold of the forest, but because of the strange sound of footsteps echoing in the darkness. Daniel and his two remaining friends, Mike and Jason, were still fast asleep. I stepped out of the tent, shotgun slung over my shoulder, the tension still lingering. As I looked around the campsite, something stopped me. There were footprints all around the campsite. They weren't ours. I was sure of it. These were larger, but not uniform. Some were shaped like human feet, but others didn't seem to belong to any creature I'd ever seen. I bent down, my fingers tracing deep imprints in the damp ground. Something had been walking around our campsite last night. I didn't know who or what it was, but the unsettling feeling from last night was now even more evident. I shook Daniel awake, then woke Mike and Jason. When they saw the footprints, the atmosphere between us became heavy. Maybe it's people from the town? Jason tried to reassure, but he didn't believe his own words. If it was people, why didn't they leave any signs? No noise, no light. And why are the footprints shaped like this? I replied. No one had an answer. Despite the unsettling feeling, we decided to continue with the hunting plan. We split into two groups. I went with Daniel, while Mike and Jason went in the opposite direction. The forest remained as eerie as last night. No bird song, no rustling of leaves in the wind. Just absolute silence. As Daniel and I moved deeper into the woods, I felt like something was watching us. Every step we took echoed, as if someone were mimicking our footsteps in the darkness. Do you feel like someone is watching you? Daniel asked, his voice low. I nodded, but I didn't want to show my fear. Suddenly, we heard a strange noise. It wasn't animal noises, nor was it wind. Something was tapping against a tree, rhythmically, as if someone was giving a signal. Knock, knock, knock. We stood still, shotguns raised, eyes scanning the woods. No one. Just tall trees, shadows between the branches, and the feeling that something was lurking just beyond our sight. Knock, knock, knock. This time, the sound came from behind us. I spun around, my hand tightening on the gun. I felt cold sweat rolling down my forehead. Daniel swallowed, whispering, "We should get back to camp." I nodded. We moved quickly, but didn't run. I didn't want to agitate whatever was watching us. The feeling of being stalked didn't lessen. It only grew stronger. With every step we took, the tapping on the tree trunk repeated. Knock, 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 closer this time. So close that I could feel the chill in the air. As we neared camp, Daniel suddenly pulled me to a stop. "Do you see anything?" he whispered, his voice tense. I looked in the direction he was pointing. About 20 meters away, right in the middle of the dense trees, there was a figure. It stood there, motionless, no face, just a long shadow with empty eyes watching us. I couldn't move. My whole body was stiff, as if some invisible force was holding me back. Daniel grabbed my hand and pulled. "Run!" We ran toward the camp, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding. My breathing was ragged. I could feel it moving with us. It didn't make a sound, but I knew it was right behind us. We rushed into the camp, crashing into Mike and Jason, who had just turned around. Before they could ask what was happening, a scream rang out from the woods. A scream that didn't sound human. It echoed through the woods, drawn out, distorted, as if it came from something that didn't belong to this world. The four of us stood still, terrified. And then, from the darkness, a hand reached out from behind a nearby tree. A dark hand, long and thin, with slender fingers and sharp nails. It didn't move. It just stood there, reaching out from the darkness, as if waiting for one of us to come forward. No one dared to breathe. I don't know how long I stood there, but when I blinked, the hand was gone. I turned to look at my friends. No one said anything. We all knew. We had just seen something that no human should have seen. Daniel whispered, "We have to leave now." I nodded, but deep down, I knew that this forest would not let us leave easily. I don't know how long I stood there. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. We all stood still, eyes glued to where the hand had emerged from the darkness, but it was gone, as if it had never been there. No one dared to say a word. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave, now." Mike and Jason nodded, but I could see the fear in their eyes. I turned back to look into the forest, where the darkness was swallowing the trees. There was something out there, something not of this world. "We're going," I said, my voice hoarse. "But we need to prepare. If we just run, we'll get lost." No one objected. We quickly packed up what we could, put out the campfire, checked our weapons. But as soon as I turned back, I realized something had changed. All our footprints were gone. The soft dirt beneath our feet was still there, but there were no tracks, not a single shoe print, not a trace of movement, as if we had never been here. "It can't be," Jason muttered, eyes wide. "We've been walking here all day." No one had an explanation. No birds, no insects, just absolute silence. We began to leave the camp. No one spoke, each step careful. We stuck close together, eyes glued to the faint trails leading out of the woods. But when we'd gone about half a mile, I sensed something was wrong. Daniel stopped abruptly. "Wait," he said, his voice shaking. "We went through here." I frowned. It can't be. But as I looked around, I realized he was right. Right in front of us, on the trunk of an old oak tree, there was a small carving, a mark we had made when we were near camp. We were back where we were. Mike took a breath, trying to contain his panic. "It can't be. We're going straight. We're not turning back." But no matter how hard he tried to reason, the truth remained. This forest had brought us back. I turned around, but when I looked deeper into the trees, I saw him. Not far away, between the towering trunks, a figure stood silent, motionless. He had no face, or at least I couldn't see it. He was tall. His body was thin. His arms were abnormally long. But the scariest thing was that he didn't move. He just stood there, looking at us. None of us said anything. It felt like the world had stopped, like time had stopped. I didn't know what would happen if I moved, but my instincts told me I shouldn't. He stood there. Then, for an endless moment, he began to walk. No sound, no footsteps. But he was getting closer. Daniel tightened his grip on his gun, his voice cracking. "Run!" No one objected. We dashed forward, through the dark forest, running as fast as we could. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him following. No sound, no breathing, just his presence, Leaves whipped at my face. Branches tore at my arms, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. We ran and ran until I realized we were back at camp again. I screamed in despair. We couldn't escape. The darkness was thick, closing in on us. I felt him right behind me. And then, a voice rang out right in my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." I turned around. He was right in front of me. I screamed, and then everything went blank. I don't remember what happened after I screamed. Everything seemed to be swallowed by darkness. I felt myself falling into an endless void, with no gravity, no light, nothing but a sense of dread gripping my body. Then suddenly, I woke up. I was lying on the cold ground, the smell of damp earth rising around me. The trees around me were eerily silent, as if the entire forest had died. I lifted my head, realizing I was still at camp, but something was wrong. No one was there. The tent was still there, but Daniel, Mike, and Jason were gone. I jumped up, my eyes darting around the area. All of our belongings were still intact. Food, backpacks, hunting rifles. There was no sign of a struggle or any sign that they had left of their own free will. I swallowed. "Daniel? Mike? Jason?" No one answered. The silence settled over me like a thick, cold blanket. I reached for my gun, my heart pounding. Something had taken them, and then I heard a whisper. It came from deep in the woods, soft but clear. Not the wind, not an animal, but the whisper of someone. Or something. I walked slowly toward the sound, each step heavy on the leaf-covered ground. Every step I took, the whisper receded, as if it were leading me deeper into the darkness. I wanted to turn back. Every instinct in me screamed at me not to go on. But I couldn't. I had to find my friend. The shadows of the trees grew thicker, the pale moonlight filtering through the leaves, creating strange patterns on the ground. Then I saw it. A track, not a footprint. There were drag marks, long deep into the woods, through the soft earth. My heart sank. Something had dragged them away. I slowed, trying not to make a sound. The feeling of being watched was still there. An invisible gaze, a cold breath that filtered through the air. And then I saw a tree. Not just any tree. It was tall, massive, its bark rough as claws extended from the earth. But it wasn't the tree that froze me. It was what hung there. A piece of clothing, Jason's jacket. I stepped forward, my hands shaking as I touched it. The fabric was cold and damp, but what made me shiver the most was the blood smeared across the sleeve. Then, from the darkness behind me, a voice called out, "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, gun raised. No one. There was only the forest and the shadow, standing silently among the trees. He was tall, thin, with unnaturally long arms, his face as blank as a bottomless pit. He didn't move, but I knew. He was watching me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. He didn't need to chase me. I knew that. He just stood there, and his presence was enough to bind me to absolute fear. Then he raised his hand. He pointed it at me. And at that moment, a scream rang out from deep in the forest. "Daniel!" Without further hesitation, I turned and ran straight toward the sound. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to pull me down. But I didn't stop. I ran and ran until I saw them. Mike and Jason. They were standing there, their backs to me. But something was wrong. They didn't move. I slowly approached. "Mike? Jason?" No response. I touched Jason's shoulder, and as soon as he turned, I fell back. His face was gone. There was only a dark, endless void. I screamed, stepping back. Then Mike turned. His eyes were blank, his lips moving as if to say something, but no sound came out. Then they both stepped toward me. The darkness wrapped around them, pulling them into a twisted reality that didn't belong to this world. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I couldn't let them touch me. I had to run. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold. I froze, and the voice whispered in my ear, again, "You shouldn't have come here." I turned, and everything went black. I don't know how long I've been unconscious. When I opened my eyes, I was still in the forest, but everything around me had changed. There was no moonlight. There were no old trees of blackwood. There was only darkness. I wasn't standing on ordinary ground. The soft soil beneath my feet was like a rotting carpet, its surface shifting slightly with each step I took. I felt like I was standing on something alive. The air was thick, heavy, as if I was breathing in a sealed room without oxygen. But most frightening of all, there was no sound. There was no wind. There was no insects. There was no whispering. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had to find a way to get out of here. I carefully moved forward, step by step. But as soon as I lifted my foot, a hand grabbed my ankle. I screamed, falling backwards onto the ground. A cold, slippery feeling tightened around my legs. I kicked hard, struggling to get free. When I looked down, I saw them. Hands were reaching out from the soft soil, dozens of hands, long fingers, rotting flesh, all trying to pull me down. I tried to crawl back, but the hands wouldn't let go. They clung to me, each sharp nail tearing at my skin. My breath hitched, fear filling my mind. Then I heard it. A knock, 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 knock. Immediately, the hands let go of me. I crawled back, looking around in panic. The darkness around me began to shift, as if something was approaching. I tried to steady my breathing, but my heart was still beating wildly. And then I saw him. Unlike the previous times, this time he stepped out of the darkness. He was taller than I had expected. His body was thin, but his arms were unnaturally long. His face was white, without eyes, without a mouth, but I knew he was looking at me. He didn't walk. He floated. I froze. He stopped a few feet away from me, and then he raised his hand. He pointed at me. At that moment, I felt an invisible pressure on my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It felt like something was slowly pulling my soul out of my body. I struggled, trying to escape this invisible control, but my body wouldn't listen to me anymore. Everything began to fade. Then I heard a whisper. "Run!" A cold wind blew by. He disappeared. I fell to the ground, my whole body shaking, gasping for breath. I was still alive. But why had he let me go? I didn't wait to find out. I stood up and ran away from the place. After a while of running aimlessly, I saw something that made me freeze. Our camp. But it wasn't right. The tent was still there, but there was no sign that we had ever been here. No footprints, no furniture disturbed. Everything was completely intact, as if no one had ever set foot here. I slowed down, feeling like I was walking into a trap. Then I heard footsteps, not from behind me, from inside the tent. I gripped my shotgun, took a deep breath, and slowly pulled the tarp up. Inside, I saw Daniel, Mike, and Jason. They were sitting there, their backs to me. No one moved. My heart sank. I stepped inside, my voice trembling. "Mike? Jason? Daniel?" No one answered. I reached out and touched Jason's shoulder. He fell, but not like a normal person. His body collapsed like an empty bag of skin. I backed away, too frightened to scream. Then Daniel turned around, but it wasn't Daniel's face. It was his face. I screamed, running out of the tent, but when I looked back, the tent was gone. I was alone, standing in the dark woods, with no trace of the camp ever existing. And I knew I couldn't leave this forest again. Story 5. Girl in the Mist. The southern suburbs of America are a desolate and isolated place. During the day, the fields stretch out endlessly. The roads are sparsely populated, and old houses nestle among the bare trees. But when night falls, a thick fog covers everything, turning the town into a hazy maze. I have never believed in the ghost stories told by the locals. I am a long-distance driver and have driven through dozens of towns and hundreds of deserted roads at night. But everything changed one late fall evening when I took a late shift, driving through the woods toward the town of Raven Creek. It began to get colder as the clock approached midnight. I sped through the deserted roads, my headlights cutting through the thick fog. It felt like I was hurtling into an endless void where light could not penetrate the darkness. Then I saw her. Right on the side of the road, standing motionless in the mist, was a young girl. I was startled and quickly slowed down. In the moment the headlights swept past, I saw her long black hair covering her face. Her white dress soaked as if she had just stepped out of the rain. I wasn't sure if I should stop or not. Part of me told me that this was not an ordinary person, but my conscience wouldn't let me leave. What if she needed help? I slowly pulled the car to the side of the road, rolling down the window. "Do you need help?" I asked, but my voice seemed to melt into the mist. She didn't answer. I stared at her. She stood still, not moving, not reacting. I felt the air around me grow colder. A light wind blew by, shaking the bare branches on both sides of the road. I took a deep breath, then tried again. "Do you need me to take you somewhere?" Slowly she raised her head. I froze. Her face was strangely pale, her eyes sunken, black as bottomless pits. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then suddenly my car's headlights went out. The darkness swallowed me. I reached for the light switch, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't control it. My heart was pounding. I tried to look at the girl, but she was gone. Not a trace, not a sound. Only a thick fog covered the road. I gasped, my whole body cold. I had to leave immediately. I turned the key. The car engine roared, but the lights still didn't come on. I tried to stay calm, but it felt like someone was standing right behind me. Then, from within the fog, a voice whispered, "Don't leave!" I shouted. The headlights turned on again, shining through the fog. On the front windshield, a handprint was left, soaked in moisture. I didn't wait another second. I stepped on the gas, rushing down the deserted road, not daring to look back. But as soon as I escaped the fog, in the rearview mirror, the girl was still standing there. And I knew this wasn't over. I drove like crazy on the foggy road, my heart pounding in my chest. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my eyes never leaving the road ahead. But no matter how far I went, the image of that girl remained in my mind. Who was she? Was she someone who really needed help or something else? When I reached a roadside gas station, I stopped the car, trying to breathe evenly to calm myself. I got out of the car and walked into the small convenience store inside the station. The neon lights flickered, reflecting on the old tiled floor. The cashier, A middle-aged man with sunken eyes looked at me through the glass of the counter. "Are you okay?" I wasn't sure how to respond. I looked around. The gas station was empty except for me and him. It felt like I was in a parallel world, where I was the only one left to face this distorted reality. I stepped closer to the counter, my voice dry. "Have you ever heard of a girl standing by the side of the road in the fog?" The man frowned, but I saw something flash in his eyes. Hesitation or fear. "You saw her?" His words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what answer I'd expected, but it certainly wasn't this. I swallowed. "So, who was she?" The cashier was silent for a long moment, then sighed, his voice growing low. "You're not the first to see her." I felt my breath catch. "Everyone who's seen her never leaves this town." I couldn't believe my ears. I shook my head, trying to find a reasonable explanation. "What do you mean?" "She was just a girl standing by the side of the road. I didn't do anything. He raised his hand, stopping me. "You stopped the car, right?" I nodded. The cashier looked at me sadly. "It's too late." I forced a smile, trying to hide the anxiety spreading inside me. "Look, I just keep driving and get out of here, that's it. I'm not coming back." The man shook his head. "She won't let you go." I was about to argue, but something outside the window made me freeze. A handprint. On my windshield, where the fog was still hanging, there was still a handprint from earlier. But there wasn't just one. There were more. Small, faint handprints. As if dozens of people had put their hands on my windshield while I wasn't looking. I felt my insides twist. Something had been there for me. I turned to look at the cashier, my voice almost breaking. "Who did you say she was?" The man took a deep breath, as if trying to figure out how to say something difficult. "She's a long-dead person, but she never left this place." I shuddered. He continued. "She used to live in this town years ago. One night, she was left stranded on that road during a storm. No one helped her. No one stopped." His voice trailed off. "She died right on the road you just came from." I felt my stomach tighten, my breathing quicken. "So, what did she want?" The cashier smiled, but there was no joy in it. "She wanted someone to replace her." I felt my whole body go numb. No, it couldn't be. I spun around, ran out of the gas station, and jumped into my car. I couldn't stay here another second. I had to leave now. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. But when I looked up at the rearview mirror, my heart stopped. She was sitting in the back seat. Her long hair fell down, hiding her face. Her white dress was still soaked. I felt my whole body go numb. Her cold breath fanned the back of my neck. And then she whispered, "Don't leave." I couldn't breathe. She was sitting right behind me, her long hair covering her face, her body drenched as if she had just emerged from a storm. I wanted to turn around, but my body was paralyzed, as if something had tied me to the seat. She was looking at me. Although I couldn't see her face, I could feel her eyes, black, endless, like two bottomless pits sucking me in. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, sweat pouring down my forehead. I had to do something. I slowly reached for the car keys, but as soon as I touched them, an icy hand grabbed my wrist. I screamed, jerking my hand away. But when I looked back in the rearview mirror, she was gone. There was no one in the back seat. There was only darkness, oppressive silence, and the chill that still lingered in the air. I tried to calm myself, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The engine roared, the headlights piercing the thick fog. I didn't wait another second. I stepped on the gas, speeding away from the gas station, leaving everything behind. But after I drove a few miles, I realized something was wrong. The road hadn't changed. The trees were still hazy in the fog. The signs I'd just passed resurfaced. I was driving in circles. I swallowed, checking the map on my phone. No signal. Calm down. It's just the fog disorienting me, I told myself, trying to keep a steady grip on the wheel. But then, I saw her again, standing right on the side of the road in the same spot. This time, she was facing me directly. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. She didn't move. She was waiting for me. I couldn't run anymore. I had to face this. My hands were shaking as I opened the car door. The air outside was so cold that I could hardly breathe. I walked slowly toward her, step by step. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She was still silent, but this time she raised her head. I saw her face. No more pale skin, no more empty eyes. A smile, a twisted, inhuman smile. I instinctively stepped back, but an invisible hand tightened around me. I couldn't move. And then she whispered, "You see me now." The air around me shattered. I fell into another world. I woke up in the car, my head spinning. Everything around me had changed. The familiar path through the woods was gone. There were no more lights from the distant town. There was only an endless road, shrouded in black fog. And in the distance, there she stood again. This time, I knew for sure. I couldn't leave this place. I don't know how long I drove. Maybe a few minutes, maybe a few hours. But no matter how far I went, the scenery around me didn't change. The road stretched on forever, shrouded in thick fog. I tried to stay calm, gripping the steering wheel tightly. No GPS, no phone signal. Just me and this strange road. Then I saw her. There, standing in the middle of the road, right in front of my car. This time, I didn't brake. I stepped on the gas, driving straight ahead. But just when I thought I was going to hit her, she disappeared into the fog. My body shook. My breathing quickened. I was stuck. I looked around, hoping to find some detour, some way out of this place. But there was nothing. Just fog. Just dead silence. And then, the car radio turned on. I jumped. A crackle came through the speakers, distorted like a signal. Then, through the chaos, a voice spoke. "Don't turn around." My breath hitched. Who was talking? I felt a chill run down my spine. Then I heard a knock on the car window. Knock, knock, knock. I wanted to believe it was just the wind. But no, it was a deliberate rhythm. Slow, creepy. Knock, knock, knock. My heart was pounding. I tried not to turn around, but I sensed something standing right outside the car. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned, and then I saw myself. The reflection in the glass wasn't my face. It was a distorted replica with pitch black eyes and a smile that stretched from ear to ear. It was looking at me. I screamed, lunging forward, slamming on the gas. The car sped away in the mist, the tires screeching on the pavement. But when I looked back in the rearview mirror, I saw it was still in the back seat, laughing. I couldn't run away. I couldn't run away from her. And then she whispered, "Let's go home." The mist swallowed me. The fog swirled around me, so cold and thick that I felt like I was drowning in a bottomless dark water. The car was still moving in a panic, but I was no longer sure where I was going. The road had disappeared. I looked in the rearview mirror. She was still sitting there, her long hair covering her face. But this time, I saw her hands on my shoulders. I could feel their weight, cold as ice. I shivered, trying to control the steering wheel, but my mind was spinning, my thoughts in disarray. She was controlling me. "Let's go home." The words rang out, not in my ears, but in my mind. I no longer felt in control of my body. My fingers tightened on the wheel, but my eyes no longer saw the road. Instead, I saw a turn. It wasn't on the map. There was no sign. Just a small path, shrouded in darkness and rolling fog, stretching endlessly like the entrance to another world. And then, my hands turned the wheel automatically. I had no control over myself. I turned onto that road without hesitation. As soon as the wheels rolled past the edge of the turn, the engine died. I gasped. Nothing but darkness, no headlights, no sound. I could see nothing but a faint light ahead. I knew I couldn't sit still. I opened the car door, each movement heavy and restrained. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, as if I was stepping on a thick layer of fog. Not quite real. The light ahead flickered, faint like a candle about to go out. I stepped closer, each step slow and hesitant. Then I saw it. An old wooden house stood in the mist. The front door was ajar, revealing a deep darkness inside. I didn't want to go in, but I had no choice. A soft whisper sounded behind me. "Come in." I turned around. There was no one but the mist. I looked at the house again. The door was wider now, as if inviting me in. I took a breath, trying to calm myself, and then stepped forward. Stepping over the threshold, I immediately realized that the air inside the house was completely different from the outside. It wasn't cold. It was heavy. The space inside seemed to be stuck in another time. The wooden walls were rotten. The floor creaked under my feet. I saw a large mirror standing in the corner of the room, its reflection hazy, as if it had been tarnished by time. Then from above, I heard footsteps. Slowly, heavily, someone was upstairs. I couldn't move. I didn't want to see who was there, but I had no choice. I felt a cold wind blow across the back of my neck. In that moment, I realized someone was standing right behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. I looked into the mirror, and in it, I saw a figure behind me. But it wasn't me. It was her. Her deep black eyes looked at me through the mirror. Expressionless, then slowly, her lips moved. I tried to hear what she said, but there was no sound. There was only one sentence, repeated over and over. "Now, you belong here too." The lights in the house went out. I screamed. Story 6. Cold house. My family moved into this house at the beginning of winter. A large house in the suburbs, less than an hour's drive from the city center. It was a rare opportunity. A beautiful house at a surprisingly low price. But we didn't question it too much. Just thought we were lucky. My mother immediately fell in love with the large kitchen with windows overlooking the back garden. My father liked the spacious garage with enough room for a car repair shop. As for me, I wasn't too excited, but I didn't object either. We needed a fresh start. As soon as I entered the house, I felt a strange chill. At first, I thought it was just the weather, but something was different. The air in the house was thick, as if it was holding something back. The first night, everything seemed normal. But as the night wore on, I noticed the temperature in the house dropping alarmingly. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a creaking sound coming from downstairs. I walked down the stairs, my breath forming white wisps in the air. It was much colder than the temperature outside. When I got to the living room, I noticed a cold draft coming from a corner of the wall. But there were no open windows, no cracks. There was just an old wall, and the cold was seeping from behind it. I backed away. There was something inside this wall. I didn't tell anyone, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I knew. This was just the beginning. After the first cold night, I tried to convince myself that it was all due to the low temperature. But strange things didn't stop. The second night, as I was wrapped in my blanket, a sound came from downstairs. Knock, 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 a slow, steady rhythm, as if someone were tapping on a wooden surface. I sat up. It wasn't loud, but in the absolute silence of the house, it sounded ominous. I listened for a moment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Downstairs. I crept out the door and stepped into the hallway. A cold feeling ran up my legs from the floor. I walked slowly down the stairs, trying not to make a sound. The hallway was dark, lit only by the street lamp outside, shining through the window. Knock, knock, knock. This time, I located the sound coming from the wall, where I felt the cold last night. I swallowed, moving closer. I placed my hand on the cold wood. Nothing unusual, until I pressed my ear to it. A whisper came from inside. Help! Me! I jumped, stepping back, my heart pounding. It couldn't be. I was hearing things. There couldn't be anyone in the wall. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It could be the wind or the old pipes. I was scaring myself. I went back to my room, trying to sleep. But that night, I had a strange dream. In the dream, I was standing in the middle of the living room, but the house was no longer the same. It was older, dustier, and darker. And right in the middle of the living room, I saw a small door lying on the floor. A secret room. I stepped forward, but before I could open the door, a cold wind blew in, and I heard a scream from below. I woke up, breathing heavily. Sweat was pouring down my forehead, but my room was still cold. I sat there, trying to make sense of the dream. But deep down, I knew. It wasn't just a dream. I couldn't sleep after that nightmare. The image of the small door in the middle of the living room kept lingering in my mind, as if it had existed, but I had never noticed it. I jumped out of bed, feeling a strange urge to go downstairs. The air in the house was colder than usual. Every step I took across the wooden floor made hollow sounds, as if there was a void right under the boards. When I reached the living room, a cold breeze swept through, just like in the dream. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the floor. If the secret door really existed, it had to be here. I knelt down and tapped lightly on the wood. Knock, knock, knock. A hollow sound. I took a deep breath, then used a small knife to try to pry open one of the floorboards. It only took a few minutes to find a small edge of the door hidden under a layer of dust. My hand shook as I yanked the wooden lid open. A staircase leading underground appeared. I backed away, my heart pounding. A cellar. I didn't know where it led, but the cold air rising from below made me shiver. I should close it. I should pretend I never found it. But I didn't. I turned on my flashlight and began to descend. The wooden stairs creaked under my every step. The space below was pitch black, the only light from the flashlight illuminating the layers of dust floating in the air. When I touched the cold ground, I realized the cellar was larger than I had imagined. Old bookshelves covered in dust, rain-covered armchairs, a table with yellowed papers, handwriting so scribbled I couldn't read it. And in the corner, a large cabinet, locked. I moved closer, feeling increasingly uneasy. The door of the cupboard shook slightly, as if there was something inside. I hesitantly put my hand on the knob. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't leave without knowing what was locked inside. I turned the lock. The cupboard swung open. Inside, an old photograph was placed neatly between the dusty cloth. I picked it up, brushing the dust off the glass. And as soon as I saw the image clearly, my whole body froze. The photograph was of a family of 3, a man, a woman, and a small child. They were standing right in this house. But what terrified me wasn't their image, it was their eyes. All the eyes in the photograph had been scratched out. A cold wind blew through the basement, and right behind me, the door slammed shut. I stood motionless in the dark basement, still clutching the photograph. The torn eyes of the people in the photos held me captive, as if they were still watching me despite their disfigurement. The basement door slammed shut. My heart pounded, my breaths becoming labored. I couldn't remember how long I'd been down here, but the air in the basement began to change. Thicker, colder. Then I heard footsteps, not from upstairs, not from outside, from within the basement. I spun around, the flashlight in my hand shaking in the darkness. There was no one, but I knew I was no longer alone. Help! Me! I froze. A whisper came from behind the old bookshelves. I stepped back, trying to steady my breathing. This couldn't be real. I must be imagining it. I must be... Bang! One of the bookshelves suddenly collapsed, kicking up a thick cloud of dust. I coughed, holding up the flashlight. Behind the bookshelf was a small door. My heart stopped. I didn't want to open it. But, as if there was an invisible pull, I moved closer. My hand touched the cold doorknob. I turned it, and the door slowly opened. Inside, it was a small room, but it didn't feel like a normal room. It was empty, except for an old bed in the middle of the room, with a faded blanket covering something underneath. I took a deep breath, then pulled the blanket away. A human skeleton lay just under the cloth, its limbs curled up, as if it had been locked in here until it died. My whole body was cold. I had just found someone's body. I backed away, my heart pounding. But before I could react, my flashlight went out. Darkness enveloped me. And then I heard breathing, right next to my ear. "Why, here!" I screamed, dashing out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran up the stairs, banging on the cellar door. It was locked. I tried to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, screaming, "Someone, help me!" No one answered, but I heard a soft laugh from behind me. Slowly, I turned my head, and in the darkness of the cellar, I saw a shadowy figure standing there, staring at me. I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. And I knew I had awakened something. I stood there, unable to take my eyes off the shadowy figure that was looming in the darkness of the cellar. My body froze, every hair on my body standing on end as if a cold wind had brushed past it. He didn't move, but I knew he was watching me. I could feel those invisible eyes, a terrible weight pressing down on my mind, as if a horror that had been buried beneath this house for decades was now rising. I had to get out. I tried again to turn the cellar doorknob, but it wouldn't open. My hands were shaking, sweat pouring out of it despite the chill in the cellar. Behind me, footsteps echoed. Slow, soft, I held my breath. He was getting closer. Desperately, I searched for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes scanned the dark room, then stopped on a rusty metal bar lying on the floor, probably part of an old bookshelf that had collapsed. Without hesitation, I grabbed it, spun around, and swung it at the shadow. But it went straight through. It was as if he didn't really exist. He wasn't human. I backed away, my heart pounding. He kept coming toward me, not rushing, not swinging or punching, just getting closer. And I could feel his darkness swallowing me up, bit by bit. Suddenly, a voice rang out in my mind. "You're trapped here too," I yelled, pounding on the cellar door. It swung open. Without thinking, I dashed up the stairs, slipping on the last step, but still running out of the cellar. I slammed the door behind me, gasping for breath. My back was pressed against the door, my hands still gripping the metal bar, my body shaking uncontrollably. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I stood there for a long moment, waiting for any sound from below. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. I wanted to believe it was all an illusion, but I knew that thing was still down there. And worse, it had seen me. I needed to get out of here. I rushed up to my room, slammed the door shut, and fumbled for my phone. I needed to call the police, call anyone. But there was no signal. It couldn't be. I checked my phone during the day. It had signal. But now, it was just a blank screen with a disconnected icon. I cursed under my breath, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, the room grew colder. My breath turned white. The air felt heavy, stifling, as if something invisible were present. Then I heard it. A knock. I froze. Knock, knock, knock. Not from the bedroom door, not from the window. The knocking was coming from within the wall, right behind my headboard. I backed away, my eyes glued to the wooden wall. It couldn't be. There couldn't be anyone inside. But then, right before my eyes, scratches began to appear on the surface of the wall, like someone was inside, trying to get out. I felt a chill run down my spine. Then a slow whisper came. "Save me." I couldn't stay here another second. I dashed out of the room, down the stairs, threw open the front door and ran straight outside. Only then did I realize it was dark. But I don't remember how long I was in the basement. I stopped in the middle of the front yard, breathing heavily. The space around me was eerily quiet. But when I turned back to look at the house, a figure stood in the window upstairs, standing in my room. I froze. The figure was looking down at me. I don't remember how I ran away, but I knew one thing. I never wanted to go back to that house again. I don't know how far I ran. Darkness surrounded me, and the cold of the night cut into my flesh. My heart was pounding. My breath was coming in short gasps. But I didn't dare turn around. I just knew. Something was following me. My footsteps echoed in the darkness, stepping on the path covered with dry leaves. With each step I took, I heard another footstep, not far from me. Knock, knock, knock. I clenched my phone tightly in my hand, trying to unlock it to call the police, but the screen was black. No signal, not even a tiny light to save me from this nightmare. Then I heard it. A soft laugh rang out from somewhere in the woods. I froze. It didn't sound like a human laugh. It was distorted, broken, as if it were coming from someone long forgotten, now a hungry ghost. I looked ahead. The road was gone. There was only darkness. No more street lights, no more distant houses, only a forest surrounding me. But I couldn't remember when I turned into the forest. I was still running towards the town, right? But why was I here? My chest tightened. I had heard many stories of cursed places, lands that held the souls of the unfortunate. But I had never believed, until I was a part of it. I turned around, expecting to see the familiar road, but it wasn't. The house was still there. My eyes widened in horror. How could this be? I had run so far. I had left it behind, but why was I still right in front of it? Then I realized. It never let me go. A cold wind blew, making me shiver. I took a step back, but the door in front of me slowly opened. The darkness inside was like a giant mouth waiting for me to enter. I didn't want to turn back, but I knew that I had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, I slowly walked into the house. As soon as I stepped in, the door slammed shut behind me. The air inside was heavier than ever. I could hear my own breathing echoing in the vast space. And then I heard a voice. "You're back." I froze. The voice didn't come from one place in particular. It came from everywhere. I slowly turned around, and then I saw him. A tall, distorted black figure stood at the end of the hallway. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew he was looking at me. A chill ran down my spine. "You can't leave." I gasped but couldn't speak. Suddenly, the lights in the house flickered violently. The shadow began to move, not walk, but slide toward me, as if being sucked into an invisible space. I backed away, but couldn't move. The darkness in the house seemed to wrap around me, holding me back. This house, it was alive. I tried to scream, but my throat was blocked. Then, from somewhere in the house, a door was slammed. Boom, boom, boom. The banging grew louder, as if something was trying to escape from a locked room. I knew where it was. The basement. I turned and ran, but the house was changing. The walls were warping. The stairs grew longer, stretching out into infinity. The doors disappeared. I no longer knew where I was, but I knew one thing. I would never get out. And the house, it had chosen me. Story 7, Steps in the Wooden House. I don't remember exactly who came up with the idea first. Maybe it was Mark, or maybe it was Jake. But as our group gathered around the campfire one cold fall night, someone mentioned the abandoned cabin at the edge of the woods. "They say there was a murder there that was never solved," Sarah said, her voice full of mystery. "A family disappeared, and no one ever found their bodies. But the neighbors still hear footsteps in the house every night." We laughed, but no one denied that the story sent a shiver down our spines. "We should go there," Jake said, his eyes flashing with amusement. "Just to see if it's really scary." I didn't like the idea, but I also didn't want to be the shyest one in the group. "Let's go then," I sighed. "But if anything weird happens, we leave." By the time we arrived, darkness had fallen over the forest. The wooden house stood alone among the towering trees, its windows broken, its roof rotted by time. There was no sign of life, but it felt like it was waiting for us. "This is a bad idea," Sarah whispered. But she walked in with us anyway. The wooden door creaked as we pushed it open. The air inside was much colder than outside, the smell of mold and decay filling our nostrils. Suddenly, footsteps sounded on the second floor. We all froze. It must be the wind, Mark muttered, but his voice was uncertain. I looked up at the dark stairs. I had a feeling we shouldn't be here, but it was too late to turn back. We stopped, eyes glued to the pitch-black staircase leading to the second floor. The footsteps continued, rhythmic, slow, as if someone were pacing up there. Jake turned on his flashlight, the weak light sweeping across the dusty steps. It could be an animal, Mark whispered, but none of us really believed it. I had the strange feeling that something was standing right there, looking down at us. Should we go up? Sarah asked, her voice so low, it was almost swallowed up by the darkness around us. I was about to say no, but Jake had already taken the first step. Squeak. Everything around us held its breath. The footsteps continued upstairs, but this time, we could clearly see that no one was there. Jake turned to look at us, smiling wryly. It must be the wood expanding. Let's move on. Though no one said anything, we all knew it was more than a random noise. The second floor was darker than I'd expected. The windows were covered in dust. The light from the flashlights reflected off the patchy walls. The wallpaper peeling like old skin. Sarah walked close to me, whispering, "I don't like this place. Something's wrong." I nodded. I felt it too. As we walked down the hallway, a door creaked open. There was no wind. No one had touched it. The door swung open by itself. Inside was an old bedroom, a dusty bed, a wardrobe rotted with time, and a large mirror leaning against the wall. Sarah stepped back, whispering, "I don't like mirrors." Neither did I. But Jake walked in. He held up the flashlight, the light reflecting off the frosted glass. I didn't want to look in the mirror, but some part of me had to. And then, I saw it. A figure stood behind us. I spun around. No one was there. But when I looked back in the mirror, the figure was still there. We weren't laughing anymore. We had truly entered a place that didn't belong to us. And I had the feeling that it didn't want us to leave. My heart pounded as I stared at the reflection in the mirror. The figure in it didn't belong to us. Darkness covered its face, leaving only a pair of white eyes exposed. Empty, lifeless, yet filled with hatred. The figure stood right between us, so close that I could feel the cold air radiating from it. I couldn't breathe. Jake, who was standing next to me, swallowed. "Did you guys see that?" No one answered, but we all knew the answer. Mark was the first to look away from the mirror. "Let's go. We shouldn't be here." His voice no longer had the teasing tone it had at first. Jake raised his flashlight, shining it into the corner of the room to check if anyone was really standing behind us. No one was. But when the flashlight beam swept across the mirror again, the figure was still there. And this time, it was closer. Sarah screamed, rushing out of the room. No one stopped her. We followed immediately, no one daring to look back. We dashed into the hallway. But as soon as my foot hit the rotten wood, a noise rang out behind us. Clang, the sound of the door slamming shut. No one had touched it. No one was standing there. I held my breath. "We need to get out of here." "Now," Mark said, his voice shaking. No one objected, but as we ran down the stairs, another sound rang out. Footsteps, not ours. Something else was coming down the stairs. It was slow, heavy, as if it was meant to be heard. I was sure that if I turned around, I would see the figure standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at us. But I didn't dare turn around. We rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't open. Jake wrenched at the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "No way! We didn't lock it." I looked around, searching for another way out. The window! Break it! Mark grabbed a nearby wooden chair and raised it to smash it against the window. But as soon as he swung, an invisible hand ripped the chair from his hands and slammed it to the floor. Mark backed away, his face pale. What the hell? The house, it wouldn't let us leave. Suddenly everything was silent. The footsteps stopped. The wind stopped. But I sensed a presence right behind us. Sarah sobbed. I feel someone standing behind me. I closed my eyes. Don't turn around. Don't anyone turn around. No one moved. No one said anything. But we all felt it. A cold breath blew against the back of my neck. A voice rang out, as gentle as the wind passing by. Your turn. The lights went out. The darkness swallowed us. I could see nothing but a thick, cold blackness that was suffocating. The air around me seemed to be sucked away, forcing me to take heavy breaths. Sarah squeezed my hand, her nails digging into my skin painfully. Mark, flashlight. Mark shook his head and turned on the flashlight, but its light could not penetrate the thick darkness around us. It was as if the place had rejected the existence of light. Then footsteps echoed. Not from the stairs, not from the hallway. From all sides, all around us. Knock, knock, knock. Heavy footsteps, slow but purposeful. I could feel them moving, not just on the floor, but on the ceiling, on the walls. Jake grabbed the door, wrenching the handle. The door was still locked. Open up, open up, Jake yelled, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Sarah started to cry. We're going to die here. Mark gripped her shoulders. No, we have to stay calm. We'll figure something out. But I wasn't sure. The footsteps were getting closer. And then, the voice spoke again. Your turn. I felt cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I slowly turned my head, and I saw them. Figures stood in the darkness, shapeless, only white eyes staring at us. They didn't move. They just stood there. I swallowed, my mind going blank. Then one of them stepped out of the darkness. A tall, distorted figure, its face blurred, but its mouth torn from ear to ear. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. I could feel the darkness around us closing in. Mark shouted, swinging the flashlight, the light flickering in the darkness. For a moment, I saw their faces. Faces distorted, twisted, as if pressed against the invisible wall of this world. I didn't know how, but the door swung open. Jake was the first to rush out, dragging Sarah with him. Mark and I didn't hesitate a second. When I reached the door, I looked back. The figures were still standing there, right in the middle of the living room, watching us. And then, I heard a soft laugh. The door slammed shut behind me. We were out, but I knew we never really get out of this place. We had left the cabin, but the terror still followed us. After we rushed out the door and slammed it shut behind us, we didn't stop. We ran through the dark woods, breathing heavily, our heads spinning. No one dared to look back, but we knew something was following us. Knock, knock, knock. Footsteps echoed in the darkness, slow but sure, as if they didn't need to hurry, because they knew we couldn't escape. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we reached the car. Jake hurriedly opened the door, and we all rushed inside. Mark sat behind the wheel, his hands shaking so much he almost dropped the key as he tried to put it in the ignition. Hurry, Sarah shouted, her voice panicked. The engine roared. Mark stepped on the gas, and the car shot toward the main road. I turned to look out the back window. The cabin stood silently in the woods. Nothing was chasing us, but I still had the feeling that something was watching. We drove back to town in heavy silence. No one said a word until we reached Mark's house. Jake was the first to speak. We should never have gone back there. No one objected. Sarah nodded, her eyes still red. We woke something up. I don't know what it was, but it didn't want us to leave. I clenched my fists. But we left. We're safe. But deep down, I wasn't sure. I had a feeling. This wasn't over. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw white eyes staring at me in the darkness of the cabin. I turned, trying to push the image from my mind. But just as I was about to drift off to sleep, a sound rang out. Knock, knock, knock. I jumped up, my heart pounding. A knock on the door. I held my breath, looking toward the front door. Who would be coming to my house at this hour? I got out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold floor. I walked slowly to the door, listening. Knock, knock, knock. I pressed my ear to the door. Who's there? There was no answer. I took a deep breath, then slowly pulled back the curtains of the window next to the main door to look outside. No one was there. But just as I was about to turn away, a cold breath brushed the back of my neck. And in the glass of the window, I saw a figure standing right behind me. I screamed, turning around. No one was there, but on the glass door, a cold handprint was imprinted, small and faint, as if someone had touched it from the inside. I stepped back, gasping. It couldn't be. Then, from deep inside the house, I heard footsteps. They had followed me home. I couldn't sleep. After what happened last night, I tried to convince myself that it was just a stress-induced hallucination. But I couldn't ignore the fact that something was knocking on my door. The whole next day, I felt like I was being watched. As I walked down the street, I noticed strange figures standing motionless, staring at me from a distance. When I turned around, they were gone. None of my friends called back. Mark, Jake, Sarah. They were all strangely quiet. And then night fell. I sat in the living room, turning on all the lights in the house. I didn't want to sleep, but my body was exhausted. Knock, knock, knock. The knock came again. I held my breath. This time I didn't go out to check, but then my phone vibrated. A text message. Open the door. There was no sender. My hands were cold as I stared at the screen. Someone was standing outside. I walked slowly toward the door, feeling my breathing become heavy. I didn't open the door, just pulled the window curtain back a little. And immediately, I saw them. 3 figures stood in my front yard. Not Mark, Jake, or Sarah. The entities had no faces. Just blurry, shapeless figures, like the shadows of someone caught between 2 worlds. They stood there, motionless, looking at me. I yanked the curtain back, my heart pounding. They had followed me. The phone rang again. We're not done yet. I threw the phone to the ground, backed away, my hands clutching anything I could use as a weapon. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. I couldn't run. And then I heard footsteps inside the house. Not in the yard, not outside the window, but right behind me. I turned around. The lights in the house began to flicker violently. I knew, right now, I was no longer alone. I stood frozen. The ceiling light flickered violently, the flickering light distorting everything around me. My heart pounded. Cold sweat ran down my spine as the footsteps continued to echo right behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare turn around. What I saw outside the window was enough for me to know they were inside the house. My phone vibrated again. I bent down. The screen lit up in the darkness. We're in. I dropped the phone, backed up against the wall, trying to stay calm, but my breathing became more and more rapid. Something was in here, right next to me. Knock, knock, knock. The footsteps moved slowly around me. I closed my eyes, my hands gripping the nearby chair, preparing to rush towards the main door. But before I could move, I heard a whisper right next to my ear. Don't come back. My throat was dry, cold breath on the back of my neck. They were standing right behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind reeling. I knew I had to run, but my legs felt frozen to the floor. The house began to shake slightly, the walls twitching, the windows rattling. And then a cold hand touched my shoulder. I screamed, ran for the front door, and yanked the handle. The door opened. I fell out, my body hitting the cold ground. The cold wind cut through my skin, but I didn't care. I was still alive. I lifted my head, looked back at the house. Nothing was there. No shadows, no footsteps, no sign that what had just happened was real. I gasped, my mind reeling. Maybe I was imagining it all. But when I looked down at my phone, the screen still showed a new message. Turn around and look at us. Story 8. Shadows that are not yours. I always hated working late. My job at a large financial firm in New York was stressful enough. But tonight I had to stay in the office to finish an important report. It was almost 11 p.m. and the building was completely deserted. I stood up stretched and looked out the glass door. The city was still lit up, the skyscrapers reflecting a faint neon glow. But inside the office, it was just me, and the sound of typing on the keyboard echoed in the silence. I took a deep breath, turning around to get my coffee. But at that moment, I saw something strange on the floor. My shadow wasn't following me anymore. My heart sank. I took a step. My shadow remained still. I blinked, trying to convince myself that it was probably just the wrong angle of the light. But as I picked up my coffee cup, my shadow slowly raised its hand, a few seconds after me. I froze. The shadow was moving, but not with me. I swallowed, staring at the floor. The shadow inched forward, as if controlling itself. I took a step back, and this time, it was no longer at my feet. I didn't dare move. The air in the room became heavy. The office ceiling light flickered strangely. The darkness from the corner of the room seemed to be stretching, creeping closer. Then, my shadow suddenly disappeared. I looked around in panic. There was no shadow at my feet anymore, and I had the feeling that it was still somewhere in this room, watching me. I tried to stay calm. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe my eyes had played tricks on me for a moment. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. No one had lost their shadow. It felt like I had lost a part of myself, something that should have been with me since birth. I bent down, holding my hand up to the light to check. There was nothing reflected on the floor. My shadow was gone. I swallowed. The air in the room felt heavy, as if someone had just squeezed my lungs. I looked around the large but empty office. I was completely alone, or so I thought. The coffee maker in the corner of the room suddenly hissed, steam billowing out, startling me. I turned around instinctively, and at that moment, I saw it. In the far corner of the room, a shadow was cast against the wall. but there was no one there. My throat was dry. I blinked repeatedly, hoping the image was just an illusion. But when I stepped back, the shadow remained still. It didn't move. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone else in the office. The shadow was shaped exactly like me. I was sure of it. But it wasn't mine anymore. I turned and ran towards the main door, the lights in the office flickering wildly. Just as I was about to reach the door, I saw a reflection in the glass. The shadow was no longer standing in the corner. It was standing right behind me. I screamed, but when I turned around, it was gone. My heart was pounding. The elevator door was just a few feet away. I rushed towards it, pressing the button repeatedly. Ding! The door opened. I rushed inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. The door closed. I gasped, trying to control my heartbeat. What had just happened? Who was I supposed to tell? Who would believe that my shadow had separated from me and disappeared? The elevator moved slowly. I looked down at the shiny steel floor. I still had no shadow. But then, as soon as I looked up, I saw its reflection on the metal wall of the elevator. But it wasn't standing straight like me. It was tilting its head, looking at me at a strange, distorted angle, as if it was smiling. The shadow was no longer me. The light in the elevator went out. Darkness enveloped me. I stood still in the elevator, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. There was no light, no sound other than my own rapid breathing. I wasn't alone. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was right next to me. Something invisible to the naked eye, but palpable with every tense nerve in my body. I fought back my panic, clinging to the cold metal wall of the elevator. I groped for the control panel, pressing all the buttons. No response. The elevator was still. Then I heard it. A soft breath, right next to my ear. My throat tightened. I clenched my fists, my whole body stiffening. Whispers echoed in the darkness. "You saw me," I screamed, falling backwards. At that moment, the lights came back on. I rushed to the control panel, repeatedly hitting the door open button. The elevator shook slightly. Then the door slowly opened. I rushed out into the hallway. But as soon as I turned to look, the shadow was still in the elevator. It stood there, pressed against the metal wall, looking straight at me. Then, as soon as the doors closed, it raised its hand and waved at me. I ran. I didn't care about anyone else in the building. I rushed towards the main door. I needed to leave immediately. I needed to get out. But when I reached the reception hall, the glass door wouldn't open. I pounded on the door. "Hey, is anyone there?" No one answered. I turned back to look at the hallway behind me. The office was empty, but on the floor, there were many long, dark shadows crawling towards me. I stood still, staring at the floor. The dark shadows were moving slowly toward me, as if they had a life of their own. I tried to step back, but my back hit the glass door of the main lobby. The door still wouldn't open. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear each beat in my head. The air around me became thick, as if an invisible curtain was separating me from the outside world. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed, jerking back, but then realized it was the building security guard. "What are you doing here at this hour?" His voice was hoarse, but his eyes were filled with worry. I tried to speak, but my throat was tight. I could only point at the floor. The security guard looked at me, then his face paled. My shadow was no longer there. There was nothing under my feet. He cursed, then yanked me away from the glass door. Immediately, the door swung open, as if something had been forced to give way. I was pulled out, breathing heavily. But just before the door closed, I saw the shadows in the hall, still moving. They were clinging to the wall, stretching, twisting, as if trying to find a way out. And in the midst of that darkness, I saw my shadow. It was standing upright, its back to me. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then, before the glass door closed completely, it turned its head. I froze. Its face wasn't my face anymore. The guard gripped my shoulder. "You shouldn't be here at night. This isn't the first time." I turned to look at him, still in shock. "Do you know what's going on?" He clenched his jaw, looking at the building as if it were a living entity. "You're not the first to lose your shadow here." Story 9. The house is empty. We moved in on a fall day when the pale sunlight bathed the elegant rooftops of this upscale residential neighborhood. It was a quiet, clean neighborhood where the houses had lush lawns and spotless streets. Everything was perfect, until we noticed the house next door. I remember clearly the first time I asked the real estate agent about it. She hesitated, then smiled dryly. "Oh, that house is empty. The owner sold it a long time ago, but no one has moved in yet." There was something wrong with that answer. I didn't think much of it at the time, simply thinking it was an empty house. But the first night here, as I sat on the balcony, I noticed something strange. The lights in that house were on. I squinted. Someone was inside, but it couldn't be. It was abandoned, right? I watched for a long time. No one came out, no one moved. Only the pale light from the windows. And then, a dark figure appeared. It stood silently by the second-floor window, looking straight at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything was perfect, except that house and what was inside it. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of the dark figure standing silently by the second-floor window haunted me. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was just an illusion, that the reflected light could create a strange image, the creepy feeling remained. The next morning, when I stepped outside to get the newspaper, I ran into the building's security guard, Mr. Garcia, a middle-aged man with a stern face. I tried to act calm. "Do you know anything about the house next door?" "I saw the lights on last night." Garcia stopped short, his eyes suddenly tense. "You shouldn't look at that house." His words sent a chill down my spine. I swallowed. "But why? Does anyone live there?" Garcia hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice. "I've worked in this neighborhood for over 20 years. That house, no one has lived there for 30 years. But everyone who has lived here says there's something inside." His words left me breathless. "What do you mean?" Garcia glanced around, as if afraid someone might hear. "I don't know for sure, but I've seen lights turn on, heard footsteps in the night. I even saw..." He hesitated, as if hesitating. "So what?" I demanded. Garcia clenched his jaw. "That shadow you saw wasn't human." My heart stopped, but before I could ask more, he turned and walked away. I stood still, a sense of unease rising. I turned to look at the house again. The second-floor window was still dark, but I had the feeling that it was watching me. That night, I decided to check again. I stood on the balcony, holding my phone, filming a video toward the house next door. Nothing happened. I waited for a while. Suddenly, the lights in the house turned on. I froze. I raised my phone, zooming in on the second-floor window. dim light was coming from inside, but there was no movement. I told myself to stay calm. But then, a dark figure appeared. It stood right next to the window, looking straight at me. I almost dropped my phone. But what was more terrifying was the window slowly opened. There was no wind. No one touched it. It opened by itself. The dark figure remained still. Then, from inside my phone, I heard a whisper. "You shouldn't look." I backed away in panic, my hands shaking as I closed the video. But the screen still showed the words. No one texted me. I didn't turn on the mic, but I heard it. At that moment, my phone suddenly went dead. And in that moment, I realized that my door was ajar. But I was sure that I had locked it before going out onto the balcony. My breath caught. I turned around, and Mr. Garcia was standing right in front of the door. His face was pale. "You have to go now." I looked at Mr. Garcia, my whole body stiff. "Leave now? Why?" I asked. But my voice was tight, as if part of me already knew the answer. He didn't reply, just pulled me inside, slammed the balcony door shut, and locked it. "Did you see that?" His voice was low. I nodded, still not fully understanding what was happening. "It was that shadow. It was standing right at the window. But I don't understand. How could there be someone in that house?" Garcia looked at me with a heavy gaze, then sighed. "I've worked in this neighborhood for over 20 years. I wasn't lying when I said no one had lived in that house for 30 years. But even though no one had been there, people still saw the lights on, heard footsteps, and sometimes saw the shadow." I shivered. "Who lived there before?" Garcia tightened his grip on his helmet, as if hesitating. "A family, a young couple and their daughter. But one winter night, they disappeared. No trace of a murder, no distress call, just vanished. But ever since then, people have been seen in the house." I felt my skin turn cold. "So, the shadow I saw, was it them?" Garcia shook his head, his eyes darkening. "No. If it was them, it would be great." I didn't understand. But then a sound rang out. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. The knocking came from the wall of my house. Garcia heard it too. He looked at me, then slowly turned his head toward the wall facing the house next door. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking was steady, neither fast nor slow. It was as if someone was standing just beyond the wall, trying to signal something. Garcia lowered his voice. "Don't answer it. Don't come near the wall." But I couldn't help but listen. I pressed my ear to the wall. And then I heard a small voice. "Help me." I jumped back. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Garcia looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "I've heard it before, but I don't know." "Who's talking?" Outside the window, the lights in the house next door went out. I froze. "Help me." The voice spoke again, but this time it was clearer. I could hear the desperation in each whisper. I turned to look at Garcia, but he didn't look surprised, only worried. "You've heard it before?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Garcia nodded, her eyes never leaving the wall. "Yes, but you shouldn't answer it." I shuddered. "What if there's someone really stuck there?" Garcia shook her head immediately. "There's no one. It's not a person. And you shouldn't." Knock, knock, knock. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. I couldn't stand still. Though terrified, I stepped closer to the wall, my trembling hand pressing against the cold paint. "Who's there?" I regretted the question as soon as I said it. Silence. I turned to Garcia, but at that moment, a loud noise came from the front door. Boom! My door slammed shut by itself. There was no wind. No one touched it. I rushed to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like an invisible force was holding it back. Garcia, help me, I yelled. Garcia ran over, pulling the doorknob with all his might, but the door still wouldn't open. He cursed, then turned his head to look out the window. Look. He pointed outside. I turned my head to look. The house next door was lit again. The second-story window was wide open. And this time, there wasn't just one shadow. There were three. All of them were looking straight at me. I backed away in panic, but at that moment, I heard a breath behind me. Someone was in my house. Garcia yanked the door open this time. He pulled me out, then quickly slammed the door behind him. I fell to the ground, gasping for air. But when I looked back at the house next door, the lights were off. As if nothing had happened, I still hadn't fully recovered my breath. I looked at Mr. Garcia, who was still holding my hand, his eyes tense. "We can't stand here for long," he said, his voice as tense as a bowstring. I nodded, but my eyes remained fixed on the house next door. No more light, no more darkness. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Garcia tightened the straps of his helmet. "I don't know everything, but I do know one thing. Anyone who pays too much attention to that house is no longer themselves." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Garcia turned to look at me, his eyes serious. "Do you feel things are changing? Little things? Are the lights flickering in your house? Are things moving around? Are your dreams getting weirder?" I opened my mouth to say no, but then I realized I had strange dreams. Dreams where I stood in the house next door, even though I had never been there. Dreams where I saw myself, but it wasn't me anymore. I swallowed. "How do you know?" Garcia took a deep breath, then spoke slowly. "Because I was you once." My heart stopped for a moment. "What do you mean?" Garcia didn't answer right away. He looked around the neighborhood, as if he were afraid someone was listening. "I was as curious as you. Years ago, I saw that light. I heard that knocking inside the wall, but I made a mistake. I went in. My whole body went numb." "You went in that house?" Garcia nodded slowly. "And I never left completely." I shivered. "What do you mean?" Garcia stared at me, his eyes dark. "Doesn't it feel strange? Those shadows in that house, they never come out. But if you look long enough, if you observe too much one day, you'll see them inside your own house." I felt my heart pounding, as if something had grabbed me. I turned my head to look at my window. My bedroom window was open, but I clearly remembered closing it before I went out. Garcia tugged at my hand. "Listen to me. You have to get out of here. The sooner the better. They won't leave you alone." But I was about to protest, but then I saw it. From my bedroom window, a shadow was looking down at us. My shadow, but I was standing here. Garcia pushed me toward my car. "Go now. If you don't leave tonight, tomorrow morning, you won't be you anymore." I took a shaky breath, turning my head to look again. The house next door was still dark. But now, my house was lit. I don't know how long I've been in the car. My hands are still shaking, gripping the steering wheel. My breathing is rapid. My heart feels like it's being squeezed as I recall the dark figure standing by my bedroom window. I know one thing for sure. It can't be me. Garcia stands right outside the car, his eyes dark, but his voice is calmer than I expected. You can't go back to that house. I look at him, my voice hoarse. So where am I going? I can't drive forever. Garcia lowers his voice. Go to the hotel. Stay there for the night. Don't go home. Whatever happens, don't go back there. I swallow, nodding slowly, but part of me still feels like this is too absurd. Part of me wants to go back and check. What if I don't leave? I turn to look back at the house. The light was still on, but the bedroom window was closed. The shadow was gone. A terrifying thought flashed through my mind. It was waiting for me inside. I turned to Garcia immediately. Can you come with me? Just to double check. I need to make sure. I need to make sure no one's in there. Garcia stared at me. Then he sighed, nodding. If you're sure, but only for a few minutes. And if anything goes wrong, we'll leave immediately. We entered the house, and as soon as the door closed behind us, a chill filled the air. Everything in the house was eerily quiet. Garcia walked ahead of me, his hand clutching the flashlight, darting around the house. I clutched my phone, my heart pounding. We found nothing on the first floor, but as I walked up the stairs, I sensed something different. The air was thick, like we weren't alone anymore. Garcia stopped right in front of my bedroom door. Are you sure? I swallowed, my hand shaking on the doorknob. I pushed. The door opened, and I found myself standing in the middle of the room. A perfect replica. It was wearing my clothes. It had my face, but its eyes were empty. A feeling of dread spread through me. I couldn't breathe. Garcia backed away, his voice strained. Back off now. Don't let it see you any longer. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then, the shadow spoke. You're back. I couldn't move. The shadow, my perfect copy, stood in the middle of the bedroom, staring at me with empty eyes. A primal fear flared inside me, freezing every thought in my head. Garcia grabbed my arm, yanking me back. Run, he yelled, but I couldn't. I was still looking at myself, at something that had borrowed my form. My copy smiled. Don't go. Its voice was identical to mine, but there was something wrong with it, like there was an empty echo inside. I jerked out of my frozen state, turned, and ran down the hall. Bam! The bedroom door slammed as I rushed out. I didn't stop to look back. Garcia and I ran down the stairs, but the darkness in the house became dense, as if the space was shrinking, squeezing us. We reached the front door. Garcia twisted the doorknob. It wouldn't open. I rushed forward, pulling with all my might, but an invisible force was holding it back. The air in the room became heavy, my every breath burning as if someone was choking me. Knock, knock, knock. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. I froze. Garcia turned his head and looked up. The shadow was coming down the stairs, not walking, floating, my shadow. It stopped at the bottom step looking at us. Then it spoke. Why do you want to leave? This is your house. Garcia pounded on the door. Do you have a spare key? I fumbled in my pocket, found the key. I shakily inserted it into the lock. The shadow lifted its foot and took another step. Clank. The door opened. Garcia pulled me out just as the shadow reached me. We tumbled down the steps. The door slammed behind us. I gasped, looking up at the second-story window. My shadow was there, looking down. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Garcia pulled me up, his voice strained. You can't go back there. If you do, you won't be able to leave again. Story 10. Train journey without stop. I boarded the 10:30 p.m. train at Paris Est station, bound for Munich. It was late at night, quiet, and fewer passengers, than I had expected. There were only a few people in the carriage: a middle-aged man in a grey coat, a young woman engrossed in her phone, and an old man in a beret staring out the window. I chose a seat near the back of the carriage, placing my suitcase beside me, trying to relax after a long day at work. I always liked the feeling when the train started moving. The gentle rhythm of the metal wheels on the rails was somehow relaxing. But this time, that feeling didn't come. This train wasn't right. I didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was the silence. There was no chatter, no footsteps from the food attendants. There was only the steady rolling of the wheels on the rails, an oddly repetitive rhythm. I looked out the window. The city behind me receded, the yellow lights fading, giving way to endless darkness. Nothing but darkness. I felt uncomfortable, but tried to ignore it. I leaned my head back on the seat, closed my eyes, hoping to get some sleep. I woke up when the train shook violently. I looked at the clock. 1:15 a.m. I looked out the window. I thought the train was about to reach a certain station, but there were no lights, no signs, only darkness and thick fog outside. I glanced around. There were fewer passengers. The young woman was gone. The old man in the beret was gone too. Only the middle-aged man sat far away, his head bowed, his hands clasped together. I swallowed. Why weren't they here anymore? I left my seat, walked towards the door of the car. I would find the train staff, ask where we were. But as I stepped into the next car, I noticed something strange. The windows were pitch black, as if the outside didn't exist. I felt the darkness swallowing this train. I walked slowly down the train corridor, my palms cold as I gripped the arms of the seats. The silence was growing more and more eerie. No one spoke, no coughs or whispers, but I knew for sure we hadn't stopped at any station. I headed for the first compartment, where I remembered seeing a ticket inspector when I first boarded the train. But the seats were empty. No one was there. I cleared my throat, trying to calm myself. "Excuse me, is anyone here?" No response. I continued through each compartment. The passengers disappeared. As we got deeper into the train, the number of people dwindled. The empty seats stretched out in an endless row. I began to feel an invisible fur pressing down on my chest. Then I saw the only person left. It was the middle-aged man in the grey coat, the one I had seen when I first boarded the train. He was still sitting there, head bowed, hands clasped together. I moved closer. "Excuse me, do you see anything strange? I think something's wrong." He slowly raised his head. The dim light in the car made his face look distorted and unnatural. But what gave me goosebumps were his eyes. A dull, lifeless white. I stepped back. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then a hand landed on my shoulder. I jerked back. A ticket inspector was standing in front of me. He seemed to be the first normal person I'd seen on this train. "You shouldn't talk to him," he said, his voice low but firm. I was confused. "Why? What's going on?" The inspector stared at me, then pulled me back, keeping me at a distance from the man in the grey shirt. "This isn't a real passenger." I felt my world spinning. What? What are you talking about? I saw him when I got on the train. I saw other passengers." The conductor shook his head, his eyes dark. "What you see doesn't mean they really exist." I gasped, but couldn't get the words out. Bam! The train shook suddenly, almost knocking me over. The man in grey was still sitting there, but I saw him smiling. And then I realized he wasn't there. The conductor pulled me back. "We have to get out of here. You can't stay in this car." The ticket inspector dragged me along. His steps hurried and hurried, as if we were running from something. I looked back. The man in gray was still sitting, but his smile was wider, distorted to the point of being unnatural. His milky eyes stared straight at me, as if he knew I wouldn't be able to escape. I turned my head, trying not to think about him anymore. "What's going on?" I asked the ticket inspector, my voice full of confusion. "You shouldn't be on this train," he whispered. "You shouldn't be here." The words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could ask more, we were in another car. He pushed me into an empty compartment, closing the door immediately. There was only one other person inside. An older woman with silver hair, wearing a long coat. She looked up at me, her eyes cold. "You're new, aren't you?" I stammered. "New? What are you talking about?" The conductor interrupted. "There's not much time. We have to get off the train before it gets too far." I was completely lost. "Going too far? What do you mean? This is a normal train." The woman shook her head. "No, there's nothing normal on this train. It has no destination, no stop. You're trapped." I froze. The conductor nodded. "Did you see those passengers disappear? They didn't get off the train. They just didn't exist anymore." My throat was dry. "No way. I saw them a few hours ago. They were real." The woman sighed. "We all thought that. But then one day, you'll realize they were never really here." I wanted to scream that this couldn't be real, that this was a joke, but the train door shook violently. Boom, boom, boom. Something was trying to open the door from the outside. The ticket inspector squeezed my hand. "They're here. They know who you are. They won't let you go easily." I felt like I was dreaming. "They? Who are they?" The woman looked at me, her voice cold. "People who never left this train." Outside, footsteps echoed, slow and heavy. The footsteps in the hallway grew closer. I held my breath, my eyes glued to the slightly shaking train door. The conductor gripped my shoulder, pulling me back. "No matter what happens, you are not to open the door." The old woman began to whisper in a strange language, her eyes filled with tension. The air in the train became stifling, as if the darkness outside was pouring in. Boom! A loud impact made the door shake violently. I almost screamed, but the conductor covered my mouth. They heard the noise. His voice was as soft as a breath. My heart pounding, I looked through the small crack in the glass. Outside, there was no one. But when I looked more closely, I realized something was wrong. My shadow was no longer there. A chill ran down my spine. Boom! This time, the door began to swing open, as if an invisible force were tearing it off its hinges. The older woman spoke faster, but then she fell silent. Her face paled. I followed her gaze. The darkness in the hallway was moving. Not a person, not something I could name, but many things. Distorted shapes, white eyes without pupils, fleshless hands clinging to the walls of the train. The ticket inspector yanked my arm. "Run!" Without hesitation, I dashed for the door of the other car. But the train seemed longer than usual. The cars continued endlessly, with no stopping point, no end. I began to panic. "Is there no exit on this train?" The woman ran behind me. "You realize now? This isn't a normal train." I looked at the conductor in despair. "You said we could leave. You said I still had a chance." The conductor didn't look at me. his eyes hard. "You only have one chance, and if you miss it, you'll be here forever." I trembled. "What chance?" Before he could answer, the train shook violently. The lights flickered. A voice came from the train speakers. "All passengers, please prepare to fade into darkness." A voice echoed through the train. "All passengers, please prepare to fade into darkness." The entire carriage shook violently, the lights flashing and flashing, causing the shadows outside to suddenly change. They were no longer blurry shapes. They began to move, writhing like skeletal entities, crawling along the ceiling. I clenched my fists, my heart pounding. What the hell is going on? The ticket inspector pulled me forward. "You don't have much time. If they catch you, you'll be a part of this train forever." I looked over at the old woman, who was muttering something. As I opened my mouth to ask, she looked up at me. "There is a way out of here, but you have to choose now." I froze. "What way?" She pointed to the window. "The next station. There's only one exit." I turned my head. The lights were flashing in the distance like the signs of some strange station. But something was wrong. I saw signs written in a language that didn't belong to this world. The ticket inspector tightened his grip on my shoulder. "You only have one chance. When the train slows down, jump. If you hesitate, you'll never get another chance." I swallowed, looking at the monsters crawling on the ceiling. They were getting closer. "I can't. If I jump, am I sure I'll live?" The woman looked at me, her eyes desperate. "No one knows, but if you stay, you won't be yourself anymore." Boom! One of the entities slammed into the glass, its face distorted, eyeless, but I could feel it looking at me. The train began to slow down. The strange station was approaching. The conductor tugged at my arm. "Now or never!" I gritted my teeth and ran after him toward the door at the end of the carriage. The shadows were creeping closer to us. I could hear their breathing, their creepy whispers. The door opened. The wind hit my face. "Jump!" The conductor pushed me toward the door. I closed my eyes and jumped. I fell to the cold ground. Pain coursed through my body, but I was still alive. My breathing was labored, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to look at the tracks. The train continued to move. The dark windows flashed before my eyes, and for the last moment, I saw distorted figures inside, white eyes staring out. Then the train disappeared into the darkness. There was nothing but absolute silence. I lay on the ground for a long time before I realized I was not alone. Footsteps echoed behind me. I turned around. A deserted station. No signs, no directions. Everything was covered in fog. The old lampposts giving off a dim light, as if they were not really illuminating anything. And then I saw a man standing a few meters away from me. He wore an old suit. His eyes were gloomy. He stared at me, not saying a word. I swallowed. "Excuse me, where are we?" The man didn't answer right away. He smiled faintly, then slowly walked closer. "You're one of the few who jumped off in time." That sentence sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed to the end of the platform. I looked. There was an old door hidden in the darkness, as if it didn't belong here. The man said in a low voice, "There's only one way out of here." I felt a strange unease fill my chest. I turned to look at him. "And if I don't go through that door?" The man smiled, a smile without any warmth. "Then you'll stay here forever." I took a deep breath, Stepping toward the door, my hand touched the cold metal doorknob. A strange feeling rose in my heart, as if a part of me had been here before. I turned around. The man was still standing in the same place. His eyes had changed color, completely black. I could no longer hesitate. I opened the door and stepped inside. I stepped through the door. A feeling of dizziness hit me as soon as I stepped over the threshold. The air around me was no longer as cool as it had been on the platform, but instead it was stifling and thick, as if I had just entered a place not meant for humans. I looked around. There was no more train station, no more dim platform, no more dim yellow lights. I was standing in an endless hallway. The walls were covered with thousands of mirrors, reflecting my image from every angle. But something was wrong. In some of the mirrors, I wasn't moving like I was doing. I swallowed, trying to calm myself. My footsteps echoed in the endless hallway. Each step I took seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if time no longer worked as it should in this place. Then I heard a chuckle. It came from the end of the hallway. Light, distorted. Not a child's, not an adult's. I turned quickly. No one. But in a nearby mirror, I saw a dark figure standing right behind me. I jumped back, whirled around to look. Nothing. But in the mirror, it was still there. And it was coming closer to me. I ran through the hallway in a panic, the mirrors around me reflecting countless images of me. But none of them were the same. Some were distorted, some had no eyes, some were smirking. I ran to the end of the hallway, where there was another door. I opened it immediately, and I was standing on the train again. But this time, the train was completely empty. No more ticket inspector, no more old woman, no more anyone. Just me. I turned to run to the door, but it was gone. There was no way out. And then the ship's loudspeaker sounded again. All passengers, please prepare to return to the starting point.